I was nearly 70 years old, but still sharp enough to notice when something was deeply wrong in my own home. That day I came back from a routine doctor appointment, and my late wife Evelyn's room was completely gone, replaced with my mother-in-law's gaudy belongings. My daughter-in-law stood there cold as ice and told me they had voted, and I had no say. She rearranged everything, her eyes sparkling with unearned triumph. I took a deep breath, keeping my voice low and cutting. I reminded them that they had forgotten one tiny detail. I am the sole owner of this entire house. They both went pale and fell utterly silent. For the first time in my life, they did not dare move a single thing. Before I continue this story, please let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to entitled family members who underestimated your worth and tried to take what is rightfully yours. My name is Richard Foster, though everyone just calls me Rick. I spent my entire life working as a structural engineer and an independent building contractor. I am a man who understands how things are put together, how much weight a foundation can hold before it cracks, and how to spot a weak, load-bearing wall from a mile away. I always applied that same logic to my family, believing that if I provided a solid foundation, my son Brian would grow up to be a strong, reliable man. I was wrong. The cracks in my family's foundation were there for a long time, but I ignored them for the sake of peace. Brian and Monica had moved in 3 months ago. They claimed they wanted to keep me company to help me through the grieving process. They said the house was too big for a grieving widower. But I knew Brian's tech startup was struggling, bleeding money faster than a severed artery. Instead, they treated my home like a free luxury hotel. They dominated the kitchen, complained about the internet speed, and parked their leased luxury vehicles in my garage, forcing me to park my old truck in the driveway. It was a Tuesday afternoon, about 6 months after I buried my beautiful Evelyn. The house had felt so empty without her. For 42 years, her laughter was the mortar that held these brick walls together. Without her, the silence in the long hallways was deafening. I had just driven back from a routine cardiology appointment. My heart was perfectly fine, beating strong and steady, a fact that would soon prove to be very unfortunate for the parasites living under my roof. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The first floor was eerily quiet. The living room was perfectly tidy, and the kitchen counter was wiped clean. But as I took off my jacket, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. Heavy rhythmic thuds were echoing from the second floor. It sounded like boots stomping on hardwood, followed by the harsh scraping of heavy furniture being dragged across the floor. My builder's instinct kicked in immediately. You do not drag furniture across custom hardwood without putting down a drop cloth. But more than that, the noise was coming from the end of the hallway. It was coming from Evelyn's reading room. I took the stairs 2 at a time, ignoring the slight ache in my knees. With every step, the noise grew louder, accompanied by the muffled sound of a pop song blaring from a portable speaker. I reached the second-floor landing and walked down the hallway, my heart hammering in my chest. Not from exertion, but from a rising, suffocating sense of dread. The door to Evelyn's sanctuary was propped wide open. I stood in the doorway, completely frozen, unable to process the destruction in front of me. Evelyn's reading room had been completely gutted. The floor-to-ceiling bookshelves I had custom-built to hold her massive collection of classic literature were empty. Her vintage floral armchair, the one she sat in every single evening, was gone. Her delicate lace curtains had been ripped from the rods, left in a crumpled heap in the corner. In their place, the room was filled with heavy, cheap cardboard boxes and several massive black trash bags. My eyes darted to the corner where the custom-built window seat used to be. I had spent an entire weekend crafting the plush cushions for that seat, so Evelyn could comfortably watch the neighborhood birds. Now the cushions were ripped up, tossed aside to make room for hideous, oversized moving boxes labeled with Patricia's name. My wife's entire life, her carefully curated collection of poetry, her hand-knitted throw blankets, her framed photographs of our early years together, were all stuffed carelessly into thick plastic garbage bags like common refuse. I walked slowly into the room, my boots crunching on a piece of broken glass. I dropped to one knee, ignoring the sharp pain, and placed my bare hand flat against the exposed oak floorboards. These were not just any floorboards. I did not narrate my past to anyone in that moment, but I felt every single agonizing memory flood my mind. I remembered the exact week in 1990 when I laid these planks. Brian was just a little boy back then. We did not have a lot of money. I was working exhausting days at the engineering firm, but Evelyn had always dreamed of having a quiet place to read. So I took on a brutal night shift managing a commercial construction crew just to afford this premium red oak. For 3 weeks, I slept 4 hours a night. I came home with my hands blistered, my back screaming in agony, smelling of concrete and sweat. I cut, sanded, and laid every single piece of this wood with my own 2 hands. I drove every nail. I sealed the grain so it would gleam in the afternoon sun. I built this room out of pure, unconditional love, making sure the floor was completely soundproof, so the noise of the house would never disturb her reading. That room was the physical manifestation of my devotion to her. And now, seeing her sacred space defiled, seeing her precious belongings treated like trash, a cold, dark fury began to simmer deep inside my chest. This was not a misunderstanding. This was a deliberate, calculated desecration of my dead wife's memory. I traced the grain of the red oak with my calloused fingers, feeling the smooth wood that I had polished 30 years ago. I felt the history, the love, and the profound disrespect of the present moment. I stood up slowly, my joints popping but my posture completely rigid. Standing in the dead center of the room, oblivious to my silent agony, was my daughter-in-law, Monica. She was tapping her designer pen against a sleek leather clipboard, humming along to the pop music, looking around the room with a wide, satisfied smile. She did not look like a guest in my home. She looked like a conqueror assessing her newly acquired territory. She had not even noticed me yet, too absorbed in her arrogant delusions of grandeur. I did not scream. I did not yell. Decades of managing chaotic construction sites had taught me that the man who loses his temper loses his power. Instead, I let my eyes sweep over the room one more time, taking inventory of the damage. I looked at the black trash bags again. I knew exactly what Evelyn kept in this room. I knew where everything belonged. And as my eyes scanned the scattered debris, a sickening realization washed over me. I forced my rapidly beating heart rate to steady. I realized that Monica's audacity was not just thoughtless, it was incredibly calculated. She had waited specifically for the afternoon of my cardiology appointment, knowing I would be out of the house for at least 3 hours. She had coordinated this invasion with military precision. But the ultimate proof of her malicious intent was missing from the debris. Evelyn's vintage walnut jewelry box, the one she kept on the small side table next to her reading chair, was completely missing. That box contained her grandmother's pearl necklace and her diamond anniversary band. It had not been carelessly thrown out with the rest of her things. It had been intentionally, quietly stolen. Monica thought I was just a clueless, grieving old man who would be too tired, too weak, or too confused to notice what was missing. She thought I would just lower my head and accept this new reality. But she was really about to find out just how very wrong she was. I cleared my throat, the sound dry and grating, in the suddenly quiet room. Monica whipped around, her designer heels clicking sharply against the bare red oak floorboards. For a fraction of a second, a flash of genuine panic crossed her perfectly made-up face. She knew she was caught in the act of desecration. But the panic vanished almost instantly, replaced by a cold, hardened mask of arrogance. She lowered her clipboard, resting it against her hip, and looked at me not as a father-in-law, not as the owner of the house, but as a minor inconvenience standing in the way of her grand design. Before I could utter a single word to demand an explanation for the black trash bags filling my late wife's sanctuary, Monica spoke. Her voice was steady, practiced, and entirely devoid of empathy. "We voted," she stated, her chin lifting slightly. "Patricia is moving in. This room gets the best morning sunlight, and the doctor said the warmth would be wonderful for her arthritis." You have no say in this, Rick. It is 3 against 1. 3 against 1. The words hung in the air, heavy and absurd. I shifted my gaze from her defiant face to the doorway behind her. Brian, my own flesh and blood, had silently slipped into the room. He stood half hidden in the shadow of the doorframe, his shoulders slumped, his eyes firmly glued to the baseboards. He refused to look at me. My son, the boy I had raised to be a man, the boy I had bailed out of debt, was standing there letting his wife evict his deceased mother's memory from her own home. If I were a different man, a younger man driven by hot temper and fragile ego, I would have exploded. I would have screamed until the walls shook. I would have grabbed those heavy trash bags and thrown them down the stairs, and I would have thrown Monica and Brian right out the front door after them. But I did not scream. I did not raise my voice. I am a master builder, a man who has spent 50 years studying the stress points of steel beams, the load-bearing capacity of concrete foundations, and the structural integrity of complex architecture. When you build a skyscraper, you do not panic when you see a hairline fracture in the drywall. You quietly assess the foundation. You calculate the total weight the structure can bear before it collapses. You find the weak point. Looking at Brian cowering in the shadows, I knew exactly what the weak point was. I had spent decades building houses that could withstand hurricanes and earthquakes, but I had completely failed to build a spine in my own son. He was structurally compromised, rotten from the inside out, perfectly willing to let his manipulative wife hijack my property because it was easier than standing up to her. Monica stood there waiting for the explosion. She was craving the drama. She wanted me to shout to lose control so she could point her finger and call me an unstable, aggressive old man. I refused to give her the satisfaction. I knew that in any negotiation, the person who reveals their hand first is the person who loses. I had to make them believe they had won. I had to let them think their ridiculous, delusional vote had actually stripped me of my power, so I acted. I let my shoulders drop, exaggerating the natural stoop of my 70 years. I allowed my breathing to become slightly labored, playing the part of the defeated, exhausted, grieving widower. I looked at the floor, shaking my head slowly, as if the weight of their betrayal was simply too much for my fragile heart to bear. I let a long, defeated sigh escape my lips. "All right," I whispered, keeping my voice intentionally frail and hollow. "If that is what you all decided, then that is what it is. I am too tired to fight you on this, Monica. Just please be careful with Evelyn's books." The transformation in Monica's posture was instantaneous. Her shoulders relaxed and a smug, victorious smile spread across her face. She had expected a war, and instead I had handed her an unconditional surrender. She practically glowed with the thrill of dominance. "Do not worry, Rick," she said, her tone suddenly dripping with a sickening, patronizing sweetness. "The cleaning crew will take the bags to the donation center tomorrow. It is really for the best. You need to move on, and Patricia really needs the space. We are just doing what is best for the family." I nodded slowly, keeping my eyes cast downward. I turned around and began to walk out of the room, dragging my feet slightly to complete the illusion of my total defeat. Brian stepped aside to let me pass in the hallway, still refusing to meet my gaze. I could smell the expensive cologne he bought, using the secondary credit card I paid for every month. The sheer audacity of their entitlement was staggering, but I locked my rage away in a dark, quiet place in my mind. I needed to plan. I needed to gather my resources. I needed to let them dig their own graves so deep that they would never be able to climb out. I walked slowly down the long hallway toward the master bedroom, projecting the image of a broken man retreating to his cave. The hardwood floors creaked slightly under my boots, a familiar sound that usually brought me comfort, but today it felt like a warning. The house was speaking to me, reminding me that I was the one who held the deed, the mortgage, and the absolute legal authority over every single nail and wooden beam in this structure. They had voted. The sheer stupidity of that statement echoed in my head. You cannot vote to take over a house you do not own. It was a dictatorship, and they had just provoked the dictator. As I reached the end of the hall, my eyes landed on a row of black trash bags that Monica had dragged out of the reading room and lined up against the wall. These bags were waiting to be hauled downstairs for the donation truck. The plastic was thin, stretched tight against the sharp corners of picture frames, hardcover books, and decorative knickknacks. I stopped walking. The hallway was quiet, save for the muffled sound of Monica barking orders at Brian back in the reading room. I knelt down beside the first heavy bag, my joints popping softly in the quiet corridor. I carefully untied the red plastic drawstring of the largest bag, peeling the plastic back to inspect the contents. I saw Evelyn's favorite cashmere sweaters, her framed cross-stitch projects, and her collection of porcelain teacups carelessly thrown together. My heart ached at the sight, but I kept my hands steady. I gently pushed the sweaters aside, searching for the heavy, solid shape of Evelyn's vintage walnut jewelry box. It was a custom piece I had commissioned for our 20th wedding anniversary. It was carved from solid walnut lined with emerald green velvet, and heavy enough that it could not be easily misplaced or accidentally thrown away. It always sat dead center on the small oak side table next to her armchair. I checked the first bag thoroughly. It was not there. I moved to the second bag, untying it with meticulous care to avoid making any noise. More books, more clothes, but no wooden box. I systematically checked every single bag lined up in the hallway, my bare hands shifting through the discarded remnants of my 42-year marriage. The box was nowhere to be found. I closed my eyes and visualized the reading room as it had been just a few hours ago. The side table had been stripped bare, but the heavy wooden box was not in the donation piles. I stood up slowly, the cold realization washing over me like a bucket of ice water. The jewelry box contained Evelyn's grandmother's antique pearl necklace, her diamond anniversary band, and several pairs of valuable gold earrings. Those pieces were not just sentimental. They were worth thousands of dollars. Monica had not carelessly thrown the box away in her haste to clear the room. She had deliberately removed it. She had stolen it. The puzzle pieces snapped together in my analytical mind with terrifying clarity. This was never just about giving Patricia a sunny room for her fake arthritis. This was a calculated, systematic financial invasion. They were not just taking my space. They were liquidating my assets. They were testing the waters, seeing what they could steal right under my nose while I played the grieving, oblivious old man. I stood alone in the dim hallway, looking at the trash bags holding my wife's life. The sadness evaporated, completely burned away by a cold, searing focus. Monica thought she had won. Brian thought he had avoided a conflict. They thought they had successfully manipulated a tired old man into submitting to their delusional rules. They had no idea that they had just handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy them. I quietly retied the plastic bags, smoothing them out so no one would know they had been opened. I walked into my bedroom and closed the heavy oak door, locking it silently behind me. I walked over to my desk, picked up my phone, and prepared to make the first move in a war they did not even know had begun. Dinner that evening was a masterclass in suffocating, psychological warfare. We sat around the formal dining room, the crystal chandelier casting a warm, deceptive glow over the three of us. Monica had prepared a roasted chicken, presenting it on one of Evelyn's finest porcelain platters, as if she were the gracious hostess of my home. She poured wine with steady hands, her face a mask of domestic tranquility. Brian sat across from me, picking at his food, his eyes darting everywhere except my face. I sat at the head of the table, resting my hands flat against the polished surface of the solid mahogany dining table. I built this table 30 years ago. I remember selecting the raw timber, feeling the heavy, dense weight of the wood, and spending weeks sanding it down until it was smooth as glass. It was designed to hold the weight of a growing family, to be the anchor of our holiday meals, a sturdy foundation. Decades of shared history. Now, it felt like the site of a hostile corporate takeover. I gripped the beveled edge tightly, pressing my fingertips into the hard wood to keep my raging emotions perfectly anchored. I took a slow sip of my water, waiting for them to make the first verbal move. I knew they needed to justify what they had done upstairs. They needed to wrap their invasion in a blanket of fake concern to soothe whatever microscopic remnants of conscience they still possessed. Brian finally cleared his throat, the sound incredibly loud in the tense silence of the dining room. He set his fork down and leaned forward, adopting a posture he probably thought conveyed mature authority. "Dad," he began, his voice taking on a practiced, gentle cadence. "Monica and I were talking, and we want to make sure you understand why we are doing all of this, why we had to move things around upstairs today. We moved in here because we care about you. You are 70 years old now, Dad. You are living in this massive house all by yourself, and grieving takes a toll on a person. We want to be here to take care of you in your old age, to make sure you are not lonely or overwhelmed by the upkeep of this property. It is just too much space for one man, and putting Patricia in that room makes logical sense for everyone involved." I listened to his words, my face remaining completely blank and receptive. Internally, I was dissecting every single syllable he uttered. During my decades as a master builder, I had dealt with countless subcontractors. I knew exactly what it sounded like when a plumber or an electrician was trying to cover up a botched job. They always used that exact same tone. It was a mixture of forced confidence, false empathy, and rapid oversharing. They would smile and tell you that the leaking pipe was actually a feature, an unavoidable reality of the foundation, completely ignoring the fact that they had cut corners to save a buck. Brian sounded exactly like a failing contractor trying to convince the building inspector that a structural wall was completely unnecessary. He was trying to frame an aggressive territorial grab as an act of familial charity. I did not interrupt him. I let him talk, allowing him to weave his web of hollow justifications, committing his lies to my memory. I nodded slowly, putting on my best performance of a tired, appreciative father. "I appreciate the concern, Brian," I said, keeping my tone soft and slightly gravelly. "I really do. It has been difficult since your mother passed. But while the cleaning crew was moving her things into those trash bags today, it seems they misplaced something very important." Evelyn's vintage walnut jewelry box was not in the hallway with the rest of her belongings. It holds her grandmother's pearls and her anniversary ring. I would like it returned immediately. The temperature in the dining room plummeted instantly. Brian swallowed hard, his throat bobbing nervously. He shot a rapid, panicked glance at Monica, completely giving away their silent complicity. Monica did not flinch. She took a delicate bite of her chicken, chewed slowly, and dabbed her mouth with a linen napkin. "Oh, Rick," she said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "That is such a shame. Those cleaning crews can be so incredibly careless when they are rushing to clear out a space. They probably just swept it into a donation bin by accident. I am sure it was an honest mistake." Brian quickly jumped in, eager to smooth over the terrifying crack I had just introduced into their perfect narrative. "Yes, Dad, exactly. It was just a cleaning crew error. They were moving so fast. But do not worry at all. I will call the donation center first thing in the morning and see if they can track it down. And if they cannot find it, Monica and I will gladly replace it. We will buy you a new box, and we can even look into replacing the jewelry. We want you to be happy, Dad. Replace it." The sheer arrogance of the word made my stomach turn. "You do not replace a family heirloom passed down through 3 generations. You do not replace the diamond ring I saved up for 5 years to buy my wife. And you certainly do not replace it when you are the very thieves who stole it in the first place." I looked directly into Brian's eyes, searching for a shred of the boy I had raised a single ounce of genuine remorse. I found nothing but cowardice. He was protecting his wife's theft right to my face, choosing her greed over his own mother's legacy. I gripped the underside of the mahogany table even harder, feeling the smooth wood grounding my rising fury. I knew they had no intention of calling any donation center. I knew the jewelry was probably already locked in Monica's private safe or being appraised at a local pawn shop. But I could not accuse them without absolute proof. I had to play the long game. I had to let them feel secure in their deception. I gave them a weak, grateful smile, nodding my head, as if I believed every absurd word they had just fed me. "Thank you, Brian," I murmured quietly. "That would mean a lot to me. I would hate to lose those memories." Monica smiled back, a sharp, predatory lifting of her lips. "Of course, Rick. We are a family. We take care of our own." The rest of the dinner passed in agonizingly polite conversation. They talked about the weather, about a new restaurant opening downtown, acting as if they had not just gutted my home and robbed me blind. I chewed my food mechanically, swallowing the bitter taste of betrayal with every single bite. I was no longer a father sharing a meal with his son. I was an investigator sitting across from two hostile targets, studying their weaknesses, analyzing their tactics, and preparing for an absolute war. Every bite of the food tasted like pure ash in my mouth. As the dinner finally concluded, the sharp, persistent ringing of the front doorbell shattered the false peace of the evening. Monica's eyes lit up with genuine excitement. "Oh, she must be here," she announced, practically leaping out of her dining chair. She hurried toward the front foyer, her heels tapping against the hardwood, with Brian trailing dutifully behind her, like an obedient lapdog. I remained seated at the head of the mahogany table, taking a final deliberate sip of my water, before rising slowly to follow them. I walked down the corridor, adopting my slow, shuffling gait, arriving just in time to see the heavy oak front door swing open. Patricia, Monica's mother, stood on the front porch under the amber glow of the exterior lights. She was a woman in her late 60s, draped in an expensive trench coat, her face heavily powdered and completely devoid of any genuine warmth. She was loudly complaining the very moment she crossed the threshold, her voice a grating, nasal whine. "Oh, the long, exhausting drive was absolutely miserable, and my severe arthritis is simply killing me today," she declared, rubbing her wrist dramatically for emphasis. "This damp, awful weather is terrible for my joints. I truly hope that upstairs room has proper heating, Monica, because I simply cannot climb those stairs if my knees lock up." She perfectly projected the image of a frail, suffering woman, a victim of her own failing body. But as she delivered her theatrical monologue about her crippling, agonizing pain, she casually reached down with one hand, grabbed the handle of a massive, fully loaded designer suitcase, and effortlessly hoisted the heavy bag right over the raised threshold, without a single flinch or any hesitation at all, exposing the entire medical excuse as an absolute pathetic lie. I watched Patricia drag that heavy suitcase across the foyer, her supposed debilitating arthritis miraculously vanishing the moment she thought nobody was paying attention to her sudden burst of physical exertion. The following days bled into one another, forming a suffocating new reality within the walls of my own home. Patricia completely took over Evelyn's room with a ruthless efficiency that perfectly mirrored her daughter's brazen entitlement. The vintage floral wallpaper my wife had so carefully chosen was promptly covered by large, gaudy mirrors and cheap, mass-produced artwork. The delicate smell of Evelyn's lavender perfume, a scent that had lingered in those floorboards for decades, was rapidly replaced by the pungent, overpowering odor of Patricia's expensive floral aerosol sprays and the constant suffocating aroma of dark roasted espresso. She did not act like an ailing woman seeking a quiet, sunny refuge to ease her aching joints. She acted like a newly crowned queen establishing her royal court right in the middle of my personal sanctuary. I adapted to the situation. I became a ghost haunting my own property. I realized that the greatest weapon I possessed was their profound underestimation of my intelligence and my physical capabilities. If they wanted me to be a clueless, deaf, invisible old man, then I would give them the performance of a lifetime. I shuffled my feet when I walked through the main areas. I asked them to repeat themselves constantly, pretending I could not hear their hushed, venomous whispers in the kitchen. I retreated to the small basement bedroom, a space I had originally finished as a temporary guest suite during the early years of our marriage, allowing them to believe they had successfully banished me to the subterranean depths of the house. I kept my head down, my mouth completely shut, and my eyes wide open. My background as a master builder gave me a distinct tactical advantage. When I constructed this house, I designed the intricate ventilation system myself. I knew exactly how sound traveled through the aluminum ductwork. I knew which floorboards creaked under pressure and which ones were entirely silent. I knew how to move through the hallways without making a single sound, stepping precisely on the reinforced joists that I had secured with heavy steel brackets 30 years ago. I was completely invisible, entirely undetected, in a structure I knew better than the back of my own hand. By the second week of Patricia's residency, the fake medical crisis had been entirely abandoned behind closed doors. Her room became the designated gathering place for Monica, Patricia, and their shallow circle of neighborhood friends. Almost every afternoon, luxury vehicles would park in my driveway, and loud, obnoxious laughter would echo down the main staircase. They drank expensive wine, complained about their manicurists, and paraded around my home as if I had already been buried next to Evelyn in the local cemetery. It was a Thursday afternoon when I decided to test the extreme limits of my invisibility. The house was filled with the shrill sounds of their afternoon gathering. I prepared a polished silver tray with a porcelain teapot, 3 delicate matching cups, and a small plate of shortbread cookies. I arranged my face into a mask of pathetic, subservient eagerness, playing the role of the docile servant, bringing refreshments to the new masters of the estate. My hands shook slightly, a deliberate addition to my performance as I gripped the handles of the heavy tray. I ascended the staircase slowly, taking agonizingly long pauses on each step to ensure my approach seemed laborious and exhausting. The heavy oak door to Evelyn's former sanctuary was left slightly ajar, casting a narrow sliver of bright afternoon sunlight across the dim carpet of the hallway corridor. The cheerful, clinking sounds of glass and the sharp, overlapping voices of the women spilled out into the open air. I reached the top landing and stepped onto the silent section of the floorboards, pausing mere inches from the gap in the door. I held my breath, gripping the silver tray tightly against my chest, and simply stood there in the shadows, listening to the unfiltered truth flowing freely from the mouths of the women occupying my home. Patricia was speaking, her voice loud and completely devoid of the weak, trembling tone she used whenever Brian was in the room. "I am telling you, Monica, the lighting in this room is absolutely magnificent for my afternoon reading," she boasted proudly. "But the closet space is simply unacceptable for my wardrobe. We really need to look into tearing down that dividing wall next month to expand the dressing area. It is entirely too cramped for my summer collection." I heard the distinct sound of wine being poured into a crystal glass. Monica sighed, a sound of mild irritation mixed with supreme confidence. "You are just going to have to be patient, Mom," she replied, her tone sharp and commanding. "We cannot start swinging sledgehammers and knocking down walls while he is still wandering around the property. He is old, but he is still a former contractor. He would notice the structural changes immediately and throw a massive tantrum about his precious architectural integrity." A third voice, one of their visiting friends, chimed into the conversation with a high-pitched giggle. "How much longer do you actually have to put up with him?" she asked bluntly. "I mean, living with your father-in-law has to be a total nightmare for your marriage. Brian must be losing his absolute mind dealing with the old man every single day." Monica laughed, a cold, calculating sound that sent a literal chill racing down my spine. "Brian is fine," she dismissed casually. "He knows exactly what the long-term plan is. We are playing the long game here. The housing market in this neighborhood has skyrocketed, and this property is sitting on a goldmine of equity. We just have to keep the old man tucked away in that miserable basement bedroom for a few more months. Let him putter around his sad little garden and think he is staying out of our way." The silver tray in my hands suddenly felt as heavy as a concrete cinder block. My knuckles turned completely white as I fought the overwhelming explosive urge to kick the heavy oak door completely off its hinges and throw every single one of them out of the nearest window. But I forced my body to remain perfectly still. I forced my erratic breathing to slow down. I needed to hear every single word. I needed to know the exact depth of their treachery. Patricia chuckled softly, the sound muffled by the rim of her wineglass. "Are you absolutely certain Brian can handle the legal side of things?" She asked, a hint of genuine concern creeping into her voice. "You know how soft he gets whenever his father plays the grieving widower routine. If the old man puts up a serious fight, Brian might actually cave and back down entirely." Monica scoffed loudly, the sound filled with absolute, unfiltered disdain for her own husband. "Brian will do exactly what I tell him to do because he has absolutely no other choice," she stated with terrifying certainty. "His tech startup is completely underwater, and the creditors are practically breaking down the office doors. This house is literally the only viable asset we have left to leverage. Once the paperwork finally clears with the bank and the equity line is fully approved, everything changes." She paused for a dramatic moment, letting the heavy weight of her grand strategy settle over the room. I stood frozen in the hallway, my heart hammering a frantic, violent rhythm against my ribcage. The pieces of the puzzle were violently snapping together in my mind, forming a picture far darker and far more malicious than I had ever anticipated. "Once the paperwork clears, we are gutting the entire first floor," Monica declared, her voice ringing with absolute, unshakable triumph. "We are taking a sledgehammer to that hideous, outdated mahogany dining room. We are ripping out the ancient kitchen cabinets. We are going to modernize this entire property from the ground up, flip it, and use the massive profit to completely wipe out the business debt. The old man will just have to be moved into a modest assisted living facility somewhere out in the distant suburbs. We will tell everyone his cognitive decline made it unsafe for him to remain in the house." The silence that followed her chilling declaration was broken only by the sound of glasses clinking in a cheerful celebratory toast. They were drinking to my planned demise. They were celebrating the destruction of my home, the liquidation of my assets, and my forced imprisonment in a nursing home, all while sitting comfortably in the room I had built with my 2 hands. I walked away quietly, my blood boiling, realizing this was never about a room for Patricia. I walked away quietly, my blood boiling, realizing this was never about a room for Patricia. I descended the basement stairs with a newfound, terrifying clarity. Sleep was entirely out of the question that night. I lay on the narrow mattress in the underground room they had banished me to, staring up at the exposed floor joists of the ceiling. Those wooden beams had always represented security to me. Now they were the very battlefield where a financial war was being waged against me. Monica and Brian had made a fatal miscalculation. They assumed my age made me docile. They assumed my grief made me blind. But a builder never stops analyzing a structure, and I was about to dismantle their entire operation brick by brick. The first step in any defensive strategy is controlling the flow of incoming information. If Brian and Monica were orchestrating a massive financial transaction using my property, there would inevitably be a paper trail. Banks, real estate firms, and legal offices still relied on physical documents for highly sensitive transactions. I knew I needed to intercept that paper trail before my son ever laid his cowardly eyes on it. Starting the very next morning, I officially took over the household chore of collecting the daily mail. It was ridiculously easy to implement this new routine. Brian had always been inherently lazy, a trait that had only worsened since his technology startup began circling the drain. He rarely rolled out of bed before 10 in the morning, and Monica was too busy treating her mother to expensive brunches to bother with mundane domestic tasks. I made it a habit to be standing in the front yard at exactly 9 in the morning, holding a cup of black coffee waiting for the postal carrier to drive up the street. I greeted the mailman with a friendly wave and a warm smile, chatting with him about the crisp autumn weather while he handed me the stack of letters directly. I would sort through the envelopes right there in the driveway, separating the junk mail and the utility bills from anything that looked remotely suspicious. For the first few days, there was nothing out of the ordinary. Just credit card offers, glossy magazines, and Patricia's forwarded medical bills. But my patience is not easily exhausted. I had spent months waiting for concrete foundations to cure perfectly before building upon them. I could wait for the postal service to deliver the evidence I needed to destroy them. It happened on a crisp Tuesday morning, exactly 12 days after Patricia had officially seized Evelyn's room. The mailman handed me a large stack of envelopes, making a casual joke about the heavy load. I smiled, wishing him a good day, and immediately began sifting through the pile as I walked back toward the front door. Sandwiched between a colorful grocery store flyer and a water bill was a thick, rigid cardboard envelope. It was not regular mail. It was a priority expedited package, the kind that costs extra for guaranteed tracking and secure delivery. My heart skipped a beat as I looked at the recipient label. It was addressed directly to Brian Foster. I flipped the heavy envelope over and read the return address printed in bold, professional lettering in the top left corner. It was from a prominent commercial real estate appraisal firm located in the downtown financial district. My breath caught in my throat. Real estate appraisal firms do not send thick, expedited packages to residential addresses unless a massive transaction is currently underway. I did not take the mail into the kitchen where Monica was currently brewing her expensive espresso. Instead, I tucked the rigid envelope firmly under my heavy flannel jacket, pressing it flat against my ribs. I walked through the house with my usual slow, shuffling gait, dropping the junk mail and the utility bills onto the marble kitchen counter without saying a single word. I bypassed the main living areas entirely and headed straight down the wooden stairs to my isolated basement bedroom. Once I was safely underground, I locked the solid core door behind me and turned on the small desk lamp. I pulled the heavy envelope from under my jacket and placed it on the table. It was sealed tight with a strip of reinforced security adhesive. If I simply ripped it open, Brian would instantly know that his mail had been tampered with. I needed to see exactly what was inside this package, but I also needed to put it back on the kitchen counter, looking completely untouched, allowing them to continue believing their secret plan was perfectly safe. I walked over to the small kitchenette area I had built in the corner of the basement. I filled a small electric kettle with fresh water and switched it on. While I waited for the water to boil, I prepared my workspace. I cleared off the small table and laid down a clean microfiber cloth. My hands were remarkably steady. The adrenaline pumping through my veins had completely erased any trace of fatigue from my 70-year-old bones. A steady stream of thick white steam began to pour heavily from the spout of the kettle. I carefully picked up the cardboard envelope, holding the sealed edge directly over the concentrated heat. This required absolute precision and immense patience. If I held the envelope too close to the steam, the cardboard would warp and the ink on the return address would run, completely ruining the illusion. If I held it too far away, the heavy adhesive would never melt. I kept the edge hovering just above the rising vapor, slowly moving it back and forth to distribute the heat evenly. The hot steam warmed my calloused fingers, but I ignored the discomfort. After about 5 minutes of relentless exposure, the thick glue finally began to soften and yield. Using the edge of a thin metal putty knife I kept in my toolbox, I gently pried the flap open millimeter by millimeter until the envelope surrendered its secrets without a single tear in the cardboard. I set the kettle aside and carefully reached inside the open package. I pulled out a heavy stack of premium glossy paper bound together with a thick plastic spine. It was a professional, comprehensive document, dozens of pages long. I flipped to the very first page, my eyes scanning the bold black text printed at the top of the cover sheet. It read, "Comprehensive Property Valuation and Asset Appraisal Report." Just below that, printed in stark, undeniable letters, was my exact home address. The house I had purchased. The house I had completely renovated. The house I exclusively owned. They had secretly brought an appraiser onto my property. My mind raced backward, trying to pinpoint exactly when they could have accomplished such a massive deception. Then I remembered the weekend I had spent out of town, visiting an old friend from the construction union last month. Brian had practically pushed me out the door, insisting I needed a relaxing break. They had used my absence to let a stranger walk through my home, measuring the square footage, evaluating the custom oak floors I had laid by hand, and calculating the value of the mahogany dining table. They had priced my entire life. I flipped past the table of contents and went straight to the executive summary. My eyes zeroed in on the final estimated market value printed in a large highlighted box. $2.1 million. The sheer magnitude of the number was staggering, but it was not surprising. I had maintained this property meticulously, upgrading the plumbing, the roof, and the electrical systems over the past 3 decades. I had built a fortress, and now my own son was trying to sell that fortress right out from under my feet. I continued turning the glossy pages, my anger simmering into a cold, hardened rage. There were detailed photographs of the interior, including Evelyn's reading room before Monica had violently gutted it. There were wide shots of the manicured backyard and the customized garage. They had documented every single inch of my asset. But the valuation number alone was not the smoking gun I needed. I needed to know exactly how Brian planned to access that massive sum of money, considering my name was the only one printed on the actual property deed. I flipped to the very last section of the thick report, searching for the legal addendums and the banking instructions. My finger traced down the crisp white page, moving past the appraiser's signature and the firm's official corporate seal. At the very bottom of the page, printed in small but perfectly legible text, was a specific administrative clause. It was the section that detailed the exact reason this costly appraisal had been commissioned in the first place. I stared at the sentence, reading the words over and over again until they were permanently burned into my memory. The purpose of appraisal section at the bottom of the document clearly stated underwriting for corporate home equity line of credit. They were not just trying to sell my house. They were actively attempting to secure a massive commercial loan against my property, using my life's work as collateral to save Brian's failing business. And to do that, they needed my signature. Or more accurately, they needed a way to completely bypass my signature altogether. I stared at the words printed on the thick appraisal document, the realization settling over me like a heavy concrete slab. Underwriting for a corporate home equity line of credit. The pieces of the puzzle clicked together with devastating precision. Brian had launched his software startup 3 years ago with unearned arrogance and a severe lack of actual business acumen. He had burned through his initial venture capital funding in less than 18 months, wasting hundreds of thousands of dollars on expensive office leases, lavish marketing parties, and a bloated executive payroll. Monica had gleefully participated in the financial drain, treating his company account like a personal slush fund for designer clothes and upscale dinners. Now the well had run completely dry. His creditors were closing in, threatening to dismantle his facade of success. He needed a massive cash influx to cover his tracks and keep his failing company afloat, and he needed it fast. Since he had no viable assets of his own, he had set his sights on the only lucrative target within his immediate reach. My home, my $1 million sanctuary. They were plotting to extract a commercial loan against the equity I had built over 40 years of grueling physical labor. But to legally secure a line of credit against a property, the primary deed holder must authorize the transaction. I was the sole owner. I had never added Brian to the deed, despite Monica's passive-aggressive suggestions over the years. Therefore, they needed my authorization. Or knowing the depths of their deceit, they were already forging a path to bypass my consent altogether. I carefully resealed the appraisal report, pressing the flap down so the weakened adhesive would bond together as it cooled. I set the envelope aside and sat on the edge of my narrow basement bed, rubbing my calloused hands over my tired face. A profound sorrow washed over me immediately, followed by an icy resolve. I thought about the boy I had raised with so much hope. I remembered Brian at 10 years old throwing a baseball straight through the neighbor's bay window. He had hidden in his bedroom closet, crying, terrified of the consequences. I had taken him by the hand, marched him next door to apologize, and then I had personally paid for the replacement glass, working an extra weekend shift to cover the cost. I remembered Brian at 22 calling me in a panic because he had maxed out 3 different credit cards during his senior year of college. I had emptied a portion of my savings to wipe his slate clean, telling myself he was just young and learning how the world worked. I remembered him at 30, defaulting on his luxury car loan, and once again I stepped in to negotiate with the dealership and settle the debt. For decades, I had been his safety net. I had caught him every time he jumped without looking. Evelyn used to warn me about this dynamic. She would sit in her reading room sipping chamomile tea and tell me that I was protecting him from the lessons he desperately needed to learn. She knew that a man who never feels the impact of the ground will never learn how to stand on his own 2 feet. She was right. My boundless generosity had not made him a better man. It had bred a dangerous, entitled monster who now viewed my life savings as his emergency fund. I realized sitting there that I could not save him anymore. By protecting him, I had allowed him to become a predator within my home. I was done catching him. The safety net was gone. From now on, I was going to be the anvil. If I was going to destroy their illicit operation, I needed irrefutable proof of their crimes. I could not just confront them with the appraisal report. They would deny it, manipulate the narrative, and likely accelerate their timeline to aggressively push me out of the house. I needed to catch them planning their fraud on tape. I needed eyes and ears in the rooms where they felt the most secure. I stood up and pulled a blank sheet of drafting paper from my desk drawer. I grabbed a pencil and began to sketch the floor plan of my own house from memory. I did not draw it as a home filled with memories. I drew it as a blueprint for a devastating trap. Because I had physically built this house, I knew every single architectural blind spot it possessed. I sketched the exact layout of the vast living room, noting the deep shadowed recesses situated just above the custom crown molding I had painstakingly installed a decade ago. I drew the precise angle of the large kitchen island, marking the structural support column that cleverly housed the main return vent for the central air conditioning system. I mapped out the exact dimensions of the upstairs study, pinpointing the hollow cavity hiding behind the built-in bookshelves, where Brian now confidently conducted his fraudulent business calls. I knew the exact thickness of the drywall, the routing pathways of the electrical wiring, and the specific isolated locations where a micro-surveillance device could be perfectly hidden without disrupting the aesthetic flow of the room. I planned a complex network of hidden cameras and highly sensitive audio receivers that would blanket every single area where Monica and Brian congregated to discuss their dark secrets. But installing a comprehensive surveillance system required significant time, surgical precision, and absolute silence. It required drilling small access holes, routing microscopic power cables through tight spaces, and constantly testing various signal frequencies. I could not possibly accomplish that level of intricate technical work while they were pacing around the main floor, drinking expensive espresso, and complaining loudly about their stressful lives. I needed the house to be completely empty for at least a full 48 hours. I needed them gone, and I needed them to leave willingly, truly believing they had just won a spectacular victory. I reached into my worn leather wallet and pulled out a silver credit card. It was a secondary account I had opened years ago, intended solely for medical or household emergencies. I had foolishly given Brian an authorized user card for this account when his business first started struggling, explicitly telling him to use it only for critical operational expenses. Naturally, he and Monica had immediately abused the privilege, utilizing the card to cover expensive steakhouse dinners and luxury purchases until I quietly placed a strict spending limit on the account. But the account was still active, and I still received the billing statements directly to my email. I sat down at my laptop and opened a secure browsing window. I navigated to the website of a highly exclusive, overpriced luxury wellness resort located in the scenic mountains about 3 hours north of the city limits. It was the exact type of pretentious, status-obsessed establishment Monica constantly obsessed over on her various social media feeds. I selected their absolute most expensive weekend package, a comprehensive 3-day, 2-night retreat featuring private thermal hot springs, deep tissue, couples massages, and gourmet organic dining prepared by a private chef. I typed in the billing information for the secondary credit card and confirmed the expensive, non-refundable reservation. I then drafted a brief, highly convincing email from a generic promotional address, sending it directly to Monica's personal inbox. I cleverly framed it as a last-minute exclusive loyalty reward from a high-end designer boutique she frequently visited, offering an all-expenses-paid luxury getaway for 2 lucky clients. It was a glittering piece of bait she could never possibly resist. She possessed an insatiable appetite for free luxury and an absolute blindness to anything that felt like a hidden trap, so long as it pampered her enormous ego. I printed the official booking confirmation on heavy paper and slipped it neatly into an unmarked white envelope. I walked upstairs to the kitchen, moving silently across the floorboards, like a shadow in the night. I placed the envelope directly on the marble counter, right next to the brand-new shiny espresso machine Monica had recently purchased, using my money. I knew exactly how this scenario would flawlessly play out. She would see the booking assume her fabulous lifestyle had finally yielded a random stroke of incredible luck, and she would drag Brian forcefully out of the house by Friday afternoon, completely eager to abandon the miserable old man in the gloomy basement. They would leave the property laughing genuinely, thinking they were the smartest, luckiest people in the world. They would hastily pack their overpriced designer bags and drive away quickly into the mountains, leaving me completely alone in the silent, empty house. And the exact moment their expensive leased car pulled entirely out of my driveway, I would immediately begin to expertly wire their beautiful gilded cage. Friday afternoon arrived exactly as I had calculated. I sat in the dim light of my basement bedroom, listening to the frantic, excited footsteps echoing from the hardwood floors above. Monica had taken the bait hook, line, and sinker. I could hear her shrill voice barking orders at Brian, demanding he load her oversized designer weekend bags into the trunk of their leased luxury SUV. She was bragging loudly about the exclusive mountain resort, completely convinced that her superior social status had finally manifested the ultimate free vacation. I waited patiently in the shadows. I heard the heavy front door slam shut, followed by the electronic chirp of the vehicle unlocking in the driveway. I walked quietly up the wooden stairs and peered through the edge of the living room blinds. I watched Brian put the car in reverse and pull out into the street, completely oblivious to the fact that he was leaving his greatest asset totally unprotected. The moment their vehicle disappeared around the corner of the neighborhood block, the oppressive silence of the empty house settled around me. I did not waste a single second. I moved with a practiced, deliberate urgency that I had not felt since my active days on commercial construction sites. I went straight to the heavy steel tool chest I kept securely locked in the back corner of the insulated garage. Beneath the standard wrenches and power drills, I had a false bottom. Inside that hidden compartment was a collection of high-grade surveillance equipment I had purchased with cash over the past week from a specialized electronics supplier downtown. I pulled out 4 micro cameras featuring pinhole lenses capable of capturing high-definition video in low light, alongside highly sensitive audio receivers designed to filter out background noise and isolate human speech. I also had the encrypted wireless transmitters required to route the data feeds directly to a secure offshore cloud server. I carried the heavy canvas tool bag into the center of the kitchen, dropping it onto the marble island. I looked around the room, visualizing the structural blueprints burned into my memory. This was where Monica and Patricia spent hours drinking coffee and plotting. I set up my aluminum stepladder right beneath the intricate wooden crown molding that bordered the high ceiling. Climbing that ladder was the first stark reminder of my actual physical age. A sharp, familiar ache flared intensely in my lower back, and my arthritic knees popped in loud protest as I scaled the aluminum rungs. 10 years ago, I would have sprinted up this ladder without a second thought. Now my 70-year-old bones demanded a slower, much more deliberate pace. But I grit my teeth and pushed through the agonizing pain fueled entirely by a potent mixture of raw adrenaline and cold, calculating anger. I used a specialized, ultra-quiet micro drill to bore a tiny hole directly into the shadowed recess of the decorative wooden trim. My hands, calloused and thick from decades of manual labor, were surprisingly steady as I threaded the microscopic lens through the wood. I carefully routed the ultra-thin power cable behind the drywall, splicing it directly into the main electrical line that powered the recessed ceiling lights. It was a flawless, invisible installation. The camera commanded a perfect, unobstructed panoramic view of the entire kitchen, including the marble island where they inevitably laid out their financial documents. I climbed down my breath, coming in short, tight gasps, and immediately moved the ladder into the main living room. I targeted the large rectangular return vent for the central air conditioning system situated perfectly above the custom fireplace mantel. Removing the painted metal grate, I worked entirely by muscle memory. The space inside the ductwork was incredibly cramped, and the sharp edges of the sheet metal bit deeply into the back of my hands, leaving thin, stinging cuts across my skin. I ignored the warm trickle of blood. I securely mounted the second camera and the primary audio receiver deep inside the dark cavity of the ventilation shaft, ensuring the lens was positioned to peer flawlessly through the slanted louvers of the metal grate. I wired the transmitter, burying the components beneath a layer of standard fiberglass insulation. I wiped away a bead of salty sweat that stung my right eye, taking a brief, ragged breath as my heart pounded a relentless rhythm against my ribcage. The physical exhaustion was beginning to set in rapidly, making my muscles tremble and my vision blur slightly, but I refused to stop. I had one final crucial location to secure. I gathered my tools and marched down the hallway toward the private study. This was the most important room in the entire house. This was where Brian sat behind closed doors, making his frantic phone calls to loan officers and shadowy corporate creditors. This was the command center for his fraudulent operations. I entered the room and immediately focused on the massive floor-to-ceiling built-in bookshelves I had crafted from solid cherry wood 2 decades ago. I knew that behind the third shelf on the right side, there was a hollow architectural void measuring exactly 4 inches deep. I systematically removed his pretentious business books and fake decorative plants, stacking them carefully on the leather armchair so I could replace them in their exact original positions. I used a razor-sharp utility knife to score the edge of the wooden backing panel, popping it loose with a flathead screwdriver. The dark, dusty void was exactly where I remembered it. I mounted the third microcamera and the most powerful directional microphone I had purchased, pointing it directly at the heavy mahogany desk where Brian worked. Splicing the power supply into the wall outlet, hidden behind the shelving unit, required me to contort my aching body into an excruciatingly tight angle. A sudden violent cramp seized my left calf muscle, causing a sharp, involuntary hiss of pain to escape my lips. I bit down hard on the inside of my cheek, tasting copper, and forced my rigid fingers to complete the electrical connection. I pushed the cherry wood panel back into place, applying a tiny dab of matching wood putty to completely conceal the seam. I replaced every single book and decorative item with meticulous, obsessive precision. The room looked absolutely untouched, perfectly identical to how I had found it. But it was no longer just a study. I had successfully transformed my own beloved home into a highly advanced, inescapable surveillance fortress. I stood in the center of the study, wiping my greasy hands on an old rag I pulled from my back pocket. My entire body was throbbing with a dull, persistent ache, and my shirt was completely soaked with cold sweat. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my smartphone, opening the encrypted security application I had downloaded the previous night. I needed to verify that the offshore cloud server was actively receiving the raw data feeds. I typed in the complex alphanumeric password and held my breath as the dark screen buffered for a few agonizing seconds. Suddenly, 3 distinct, crystal-clear, high-definition video panels populated my screen. I saw the empty kitchen island. I saw the living room sofa. And I saw my own exhausted face staring back at me from the hidden lens embedded in the cherry bookshelf. I tapped the screen to unmute the audio feed from the living room vent, wanting to ensure the microphone's sensitivity was properly calibrated. I expected to hear the low ambient hum of the refrigerator or the distant sound of traffic. Instead, the high-definition audio receiver picked up a very different, very distinct noise. It was the sharp metallic scrape of a key sliding into the brass lock of the front door. My blood froze completely in my veins, sending a sudden, terrifying jolt of pure panic straight down my spine. The heavy deadbolt clicked loudly, the sound echoing through the empty house and amplifying directly through the speaker of my phone. The heavy front door groaned open, letting in a sharp gust of wind. Brian and Monica were supposed to be 3 hours away at the mountain resort. They could not possibly be back this soon, not with the massive amount of money I had deliberately spent to keep them completely distracted and far away from my property. Then I heard the grating, unmistakable sound of a heavy designer purse dropping onto the foyer table, followed by a loud, theatrical sigh of exhaustion. It was Patricia, Monica's perfectly insufferable mother. She was originally supposed to be spending the entire weekend playing bridge at her sister's house across the city, but she had somehow inexplicably returned early. I heard her heavy footsteps moving slowly across the hardwood floor, heading straight down the main hallway toward the study where I was currently standing, surrounded by open tool bags, exposed drywall dust, and bare wires. I grabbed my heavy canvas tool bag and barely made it out of the study in time. I snatched my heavy canvas tool bag from the desk and lunged for the small door that connected the study to the downstairs half-bathroom, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I pulled the door shut just as Patricia's heavy footsteps crossed the threshold into the study. I held my breath in the cramped, dark space, listening to her grumble about the weather as she shuffled around. She opened a drawer, grabbed something, and then mercifully, her footsteps retreated down the hallway and up the main staircase toward Evelyn's old room. I waited a full 5 minutes before quietly slipping out of the bathroom, double-checking that the study looked completely untouched. I grabbed my tool bag and silently descended into the basement, locking the door behind me. I had narrowly avoided disaster, but the surveillance system was active and invisible. Now I needed to secure the other flank of my defense. I needed to know exactly how far Brian's deception had reached within the walls of my own bank. Early Monday morning, before the rush of the work week truly began, I drove my old truck to the main branch of my bank downtown. I had been a loyal customer there for nearly 4 decades. They held my personal checking, my business accounts from my contracting days, and the original mortgage on my house, which I had paid off entirely 15 years ago. I walked through the heavy glass doors, projecting the image of a relaxed, retired man running a casual errand. The air conditioning was crisp, and the familiar smell of polished marble and ozone greeted me. I approached the reception desk and asked to speak with Mr. Caldwell, the branch manager I had dealt with for the past decade. The young receptionist smiled warmly and led me to his glass-walled office in the back. Caldwell was a man in his late 50s, always impeccably dressed, with a sharp eye for detail. When he saw me step into his office, however, his professional smile faltered for a fraction of a second. A flicker of genuine unease crossed his features before he quickly masked it with forced enthusiasm. "Richard." "What a surprise," he said, standing up and extending his hand. "Please have a seat. What brings you in today? I hope everything is well." I shook his hand, noting the slight dampness of his palm, and sat down in the plush leather chair opposite his desk. I kept my posture relaxed, crossing one leg over the other. "Everything is fine, Tom," I replied smoothly. "I was just in the neighborhood and thought I would drop by to review some of my account structures. Just doing a little routine financial housekeeping in my old age. Want to make sure everything is properly aligned for the future. You know how it is." Caldwell shifted uncomfortably in his chair, adjusting his tie. His eyes darted momentarily to his computer screen before returning to me. "Of course, Richard," he said, his voice a pitch higher than usual. "We are always happy to review your portfolio. Although I must admit, I am a bit surprised to see you here in person today." "Surprised?" I asked, raising an eyebrow in mild curiosity. "Why is that, Tom? Am I not allowed to visit my favorite branch manager anymore?" Caldwell cleared his throat, the nervous gesture loud in the quiet office. "Well, it is just that given the extensive paperwork submitted last week, I assumed you were preferring to handle things remotely for the time being, especially considering the scope of the new arrangements." I let the silence stretch for a long moment, allowing his anxiety to simmer. My expression remained perfectly placid, an unreadable mask hiding the cold fury turning in my gut. "What new arrangements are you referring to, Tom?" I asked softly. Caldwell leaned back, the color draining slightly from his face. "Richard," he began carefully, "the home equity line of credit application. The corporate HELOC underwriting documents that Brian brought in last Thursday. Along with the comprehensive power of attorney, you executed granting him full signatory authority over your real estate assets." The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Power of attorney. They had not just forged a signature on a loan application. They had forged a legal document designed to completely strip me of my financial autonomy. A POA meant Brian could theoretically sell my house, drain my accounts, and legally bind me to catastrophic debt without my knowledge or consent. He had handed the bank a loaded weapon pointed directly at my head. I did not flinch. I did not gasp or demand an explanation. I maintained the steady, unblinking gaze of a man who was entirely in control of the situation. "Ah, yes, the power of attorney," I said, my voice smooth and untroubled. "Brian and I have been discussing several strategic moves lately. He is very eager to streamline things for me. I just wanted to verify that everything was processed correctly on your end. Sometimes these legal documents can get a bit convoluted, and I like to keep my own physical records meticulously updated." Caldwell exhaled a visible breath of relief, clearly glad that he had not stumbled into a messy family dispute. "Yes, absolutely," he said, his professional demeanor returning. "The legal team reviewed the POA, and it met all the necessary compliance standards. It was processed and added to your master file on Friday. The HELOC underwriting is currently in the final review stages." I offered him a warm, appreciative smile. "Excellent. You know, Tom, I am trying to organize my home office files this week, getting all my ducks in a row. Could you print a hard copy of that power of attorney for me? I seem to have misplaced my personal duplicate in the shuffle. It would save me a lot of a headache." Caldwell nodded eagerly, turning to his computer and clicking his mouse. "Of course, Richard. I can print that right now. It is always best to have physical copies for your own archives." The printer on the corner of his desk whirred to life, spitting out several pages of dense legal text. Caldwell gathered the pages, stapled them neatly in the corner, and handed them across the desk. I took the document, my hands perfectly steady. "Thank you, Tom. I appreciate your efficiency. I will review this tonight and call if I have any further questions about the accounts." I stood up, shook his hand once more, and walked out of his office with the measured, unhurried pace of a man who had absolutely nothing to worry about. I walked out of the bank feeling the warm morning sun on my face, but internally I was ice cold. I got into my old truck, closed the door, and locked it. I sat in the driver's seat for a long time, the engine off, the silence of the cab pressing in on me. I placed the stapled document on the passenger seat and took a deep, stabilizing breath before picking it up again. I flipped past the dense legal jargon, the clauses granting Brian sweeping authority over my property, my investments, and my financial legacy. I went straight to the last page, to the signature line. There it was. My name, Richard Foster, signed in dark blue ink. At first glance, it was an absolute masterpiece of forgery. The slant of the letters, the aggressive loop of the F, the quick, sharp cross of the T. It looked exactly like my signature. It looked like the signature on my driver's license, the signature on the original mortgage documents, the signature they had undoubtedly traced and practiced hundreds of times. Monica was meticulous. She had studied the shape and the flow, executing it with the confident stroke of someone who believed they were infallible. But as I stared at the dark blue ink, a cold, grim smile slowly spread across my face. Monica had studied my past signatures, the ones clearly printed on older, easily accessible documents around the house. But she had not studied me. She did not know my body the way I did. 2 years ago, while repairing a heavy joist in the garage, I had suffered a minor localized nerve pinch in my right hand. It wasn't debilitating, and it didn't affect my daily life, but it had altered one tiny specific muscle movement. Whenever I signed my name now, there was a microscopic, jagged hesitation on the downward stroke of the R. It was a slight, almost imperceptible tremor, a tiny structural flaw in the architecture of my signature that I felt every time I held a pen. I pulled a pen from my glove compartment and signed my name on the back of an old receipt, feeling the slight catch, the tiny tremor on the R. I held my fresh signature next to the forged document. The difference was microscopic, invisible to a bank teller or a notary who didn't know what to look for, but to a forensic handwriting expert, it would be as obvious as a missing load-bearing wall. The forged signature was too smooth, too perfect, entirely lacking the organic, flawed hesitation of my 70-year-old hand. It was a flawless forgery of a signature that no longer existed. Monica and Brian thought they had built an impenetrable legal fortress. They had no idea they had constructed their entire scheme on a foundation of sand, and I now possessed the exact tool I needed to bring the whole structure crashing down on their heads. I drove back to my house with the forged document resting on the passenger seat like a loaded weapon. The weekend stretched before me, a quiet, methodical period of preparation. I spent those 2 days testing every camera angle, adjusting the audio frequencies, and ensuring the encrypted cloud server was securely backing up every single second of high-definition footage. I organized my files, packed away the physical evidence, and prepared my mind for the psychological warfare that was about to unfold. When Sunday evening arrived, the front door unlocked, and the arrogant laughter of my son and daughter-in-law echoed through the hallway. They had returned from their mountain getaway, looking refreshed, tanned, and oblivious to the invisible trap constructed around them. I remained in my basement bedroom, sitting in the dark with my laptop open on the desk. The screen glowed with the crisp, live feeds from the kitchen, the living room, and the study. I watched them unpack their expensive bags and complain about the resort staff, completely unaware that their every move, their every whispered conversation was now being captured and stored on a remote server they could never touch. Monday morning arrived with a thick, oppressive tension that seemed to settle over the entire house. I stayed in my subterranean room drinking black coffee and listening to the heavy footsteps echoing from the hardwood floors above. I knew Brian was growing desperate. The bank was actively processing the fraudulent paperwork, and the waiting game was rapidly breaking his fragile nerves. At 10 in the morning, the kitchen camera feed caught movement. Brian marched into the frame, his smartphone pressed tightly against his ear. His face was pale, and he was pacing back and forth across the marble floor I installed 2 decades ago. I reached for my headphones, slipping them over my ears, to catch the isolated audio feed. The microphone hidden inside the crown molding picked up his voice with terrifying clarity. He was breathing heavily, his free hand running nervously through his hair as he walked in tight, erratic circles. "Yes, I am still here," Brian said, his tone tight with suppressed panic. "I do not understand what the delay is about. You have the power of attorney. You have the property appraisal. Everything is signed, witnessed, and officially recorded in the county registry. Why is the underwriting department stalling the disbursement of the funds?" I leaned closer to the glowing monitor, my eyes locked on his frantic, undisciplined movements. I could not hear the voice on the other end of the line, but I could easily deduce the nature of the conversation from Brian's increasingly desperate defensive responses. He stopped pacing and leaned against the kitchen island, gripping the marble countertop until his knuckles turned white. "What do you mean?" Flagged by the compliance division, he demanded, his voice rising in pitch. "The property is completely free and clear. There are no outstanding liens. The equity is more than sufficient to cover the requested credit line. There is absolutely no financial risk here for the bank." Brian listened for a long moment, his face contorting into a mask of frustration and terror. He began to rub his temples, the carefully crafted facade of the successful technology entrepreneur crumbling into pieces right before my eyes. "Look, my father is an elderly man," he argued, adopting the fake sympathetic tone he had used at the dinner table. "He is grieving the profound loss of my mother. He does not want to deal with endless banking bureaucracy and corporate red tape. That is exactly why we executed the full power of attorney in the first place, so I could handle these stressful financial matters on his behalf without disturbing his peace." Another pause followed as the bank officer delivered the harsh reality of lending regulations. Brian gritted his teeth, his jaw muscles clenching in knots. "You are telling me that a legally binding notarized document is not enough for your underwriters?" he snapped angrily. "That is completely ridiculous. We have submitted every single piece of documentation your legal department requested from the very beginning." I watched his shoulders slump as the invisible voice on the phone laid out the stringent, unavoidable requirements. A commercial loan of this massive magnitude secured against the primary residence of a 70-year-old man automatically triggered mandatory elder abuse protections within the banking system. The financial institution was not going to simply hand over millions of dollars without personally verifying the physical and mental state of the primary deed holder. "Okay," Brian muttered, his voice dropping to a frantic, defeated whisper. "Tell me exactly what the compliance department needs to authorize the immediate transfer of the capital. What are the specific actionable options?" He grabbed a pen from the counter and flipped over a discarded envelope to take notes. "Right," he said, nodding rapidly as he scribbled across the paper. "A live video verification call with a senior bank officer. Yes, I understand the protocol. Or a certified medical sign-off from a licensed physician stating he is of perfectly sound mind and fully comprehends the immense financial liability being placed on his property." Brian stopped writing, his eyes widening in absolute horror as he listened to the final, most dangerous option being presented to him. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. Or a formal medical declaration of cognitive incompetence, which would legally trigger the guardianship clause embedded within the power of attorney, granting me absolute fiduciary control over his estate. He stared blindly at the expensive kitchen cabinets, the crushing gravity of his own deception, finally crashing down upon his shoulders. "Yes, I have it all written down," he told the banker, his voice trembling slightly, with barely contained fear. "I will discuss the various options with the family today, and we will provide the necessary verification by the end of the week. Please keep the file open and active." He pulled the phone away from his ear, ended the call, and slammed his fist down onto the marble island, the sharp, violent sound echoing loudly through my headphones and ringing in my ears. I watched him physically deflate, leaning over the counter like a man who had just been handed a death sentence. Monica strolled into the kitchen at that moment wearing a silk robe and holding her empty coffee mug. She stopped dead in her tracks, taking in the pathetic sight of her husband hyperventilating over the counter. "What is wrong with you?" she asked, her brow furrowing in deep annoyance rather than genuine concern. "You look like you just saw a ghost." Brian spun around to face her, his chest heaving as he gasped for air. "That was the commercial loan officer from the downtown branch," he said, his voice laced with absolute, unadulterated dread. "The compliance department officially flagged the application this morning. They are entirely freezing the disbursement of the capital." Monica crossed her arms, her annoyance instantly hardening into a glare of cold, predatory calculation. "Why would they do that?" she demanded harshly. "We gave them the glowing appraisal report. We gave them the signed power of attorney. What else do they possibly want from us to release the money?" Brian picked up the envelope and held it out to her, his hand shaking visibly as he presented his scribbled notes. "Because of the loan size and my dad's advanced age, the power of attorney is not enough to release the funds to my account. They require direct, undeniable verification. They need a recorded video interview with him explicitly confirming the loan or a doctor's signature, proving he is mentally competent to understand the massive debt being leveraged against the house." Monica stared at him, the color draining from her manicured face as the reality of the situation took hold. Her eyes darted around the room as her mind desperately searched for a way out of the corner they had painted themselves into. "We cannot put him on a video call with a senior banker," she hissed venomously. "He has absolutely no idea the commercial loan even exists. If they ask him a single question about the line of credit, the entire operation blows up in our faces right there on the screen. We will go to federal prison for wire fraud, Brian." "Federal prison." Brian nodded frantically, the terror practically radiating from his wide eyes. I know that he whispered, looking nervously toward the hallway, terrified that I might be standing there listening to their confession. He stepped closer to his wife, closing the distance between them, his voice dropping to a sinister, desperate level that chilled me to the bone. They will not release the funds under normal, standard circumstances. We have only one option left, to activate the absolute control clause hidden in the paperwork. He looked at Monica, pure panic shining brightly in his eyes. They simply won't release the funds. We need him legally out of the way. Monica stared back at her husband, the terrified expression on his face reflecting the absolute ruin staring them down. The silence in the kitchen stretched out heavy and suffocating. Through the headphones in my dark basement room, I could hear the rapid, shallow breaths escaping Brian's chest. He was entirely broken, a coward buckling under the immense pressure of his own reckless greed. But Monica was constructed from a vastly different, far more resilient kind of malice. She did not crumble. Instead, I watched the high-definition feed as her eyes narrowed, her mind shifting gears with terrifying speed. She snatched the scrap of paper from Brian's trembling hand and reviewed his frantic notes. "You are falling apart over a minor bureaucratic hurdle, Brian," she said, her voice dropping to a smooth, chillingly calm register. "The bank gave you the exact blueprint to unlock the money. We just have to follow their instructions. We cannot put him on video, so we will simply choose the medical route. We will give them exactly what they asked for. We will give them a certified doctor who is willing to formally declare your father legally incompetent." Brian blinked, shaking his head as if trying to physically dislodge the dangerous idea she was planting. "We cannot just drag my father into a neurologist's office and force him to take a cognitive exam," he argued weakly. "He would refuse. He would know something was wrong immediately. He is old, Monica, but he is not stupid." Monica let out a sharp, dismissive sigh, tossing the scrap of paper onto the marble kitchen island. "I am not suggesting we take him to a hospital," she replied, her tone dripping with venomous condescension. "We are going to bring the doctor directly to him. Next Thursday is his 70th birthday. We are already hosting a formal dinner here at the house to celebrate. I will simply adjust the guest list. I will invite Arthur Clark." I sat rigidly in my chair, the name echoing in my ears. Dr. Arthur Clark was a private concierge physician Monica had known since her college days. He catered to wealthy clients who preferred absolute discretion over strict ethical standards. He was a man who wrote questionable prescriptions and signed off on dubious medical leaves for the right price. "Arthur owes me a massive favor from a situation years ago," Monica continued, walking around the island to stand directly in front of her husband. "He operates a private clinic, and his medical license is perfectly valid. If he conducts a preliminary observation and signs an official affidavit stating that your father is demonstrating severe signs of advanced dementia, the bank's compliance department will accept it without question. It fulfills their exact legal requirement for the guardianship clause." Brian rubbed his face, his moral compass completely paralyzed by his financial desperation. "Even if Arthur agrees to sign the paperwork, my dad does not act like a man with severe dementia. He is sharp. He manages his own routine. Arthur cannot just sign a fraudulent medical document if my dad sits at the dinner table acting perfectly normal. It would be too risky for his medical license." "Then we make sure he does not act perfectly normal," Monica stated, a twisted, wicked smile slowly spreading across her face. "We have an entire week before the birthday dinner. We are going to carefully orchestrate his decline. We will start subtly. I will move his reading glasses and his car keys, placing them in strange locations like the refrigerator or the pantry. When he asks where they are, we will act deeply concerned and tell him he has been misplacing things all month. We will casually change the times on the kitchen clocks and mess with his daily schedule." Brian stared at his wife, a mixture of horror and awe shining in his eyes. "You want to gaslight him into thinking he is losing his mind. I want to lay the groundwork for a credible medical diagnosis," she corrected him sharply. "By the time Thursday evening arrives, he will be frustrated, confused, and second-guessing his own memory. During the dinner, we will pepper him with highly specific questions about the past, interrupting him, correcting his stories, and making him look completely disoriented in front of our guests. Arthur will sit quietly across the table observing the entire spectacle. He will take his professional notes. He will witness a frustrated, confused old man struggling to maintain his grip on reality. Monica reached out and gently smoothed the collar of Brian's expensive shirt, her voice dropping to a soothing, manipulative whisper. And when the dinner is over, Arthur will sign the medical affidavit. He will state that Richard Foster is in immediate danger to himself and is no longer capable of managing his complex financial estate. The bank will receive the document on Friday morning. The guardianship clause will activate, the commercial loan will unfreeze, and the millions will be transferred directly into your corporate account by Monday. Our problems will be completely solved, Brian. We just have to play the part of the concerned, loving family forced to make a difficult medical decision for the greater good. I sat in the cold, windowless basement, staring at the glowing monitor. The sheer, unadulterated cruelty of their plan settled over me like a suffocating blanket. My own son, the boy I had carried on my shoulders, was actively conspiring to strip me of my human autonomy. They were not satisfied with simply stealing my money or hijacking my property. They wanted to systematically destroy my sanity. They wanted to lock me inside a psychological prison of their own design, rendering me a helpless, pathetic creature in the eyes of the law. They intended to erase my voice completely, making me a legal ghost so they could comfortably feast upon my life savings. Brian remained silent for a long, agonizing minute. He looked down at the marble countertop, avoiding his wife's piercing gaze. I watched him internally weigh the absolute betrayal of his father against the impending collapse of his superficial lifestyle. The battle lasted less than 60 seconds. He let out a long, defeated exhale and slowly nodded his head. "Okay, Brian," whispered, his voice completely devoid of any remaining humanity. "Call Arthur today. Tell him whatever he needs to hear. Let us get this done before the bank cancels the underwriting entirely." Monica kissed him on the cheek, a chilling gesture of affection, rewarding his ultimate moral surrender. "I knew you would understand," she murmured. "I will start making the arrangements right now. Just follow my lead this week, Brian. Whenever your father is in the room, act deeply worried about his memory. We are building a narrative, and consistency is everything." She turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving Brian standing alone by the island. He stared blankly at his own reflection in the polished stainless steel of the refrigerator door, a man who had just traded his soul for a line of credit. I reached out and paused the recording, saving the high-definition video and the crystal-clear audio feed directly to the encrypted cloud server. I pulled the headphones down around my neck, the absolute silence of the basement rushing back in to surround me. I closed my eyes, absorbing the profound weight of what I had just witnessed. They were going to gaslight me. They were going to hide my belongings, twist my words, and present me to a corrupt doctor as a fragile, broken old man who desperately needed to be stripped of his basic human rights. A younger man might have been terrified by this psychological warfare. A weaker man might have confronted them immediately, screaming in righteous indignation, blowing his cover and giving them the opportunity to regroup and formulate a different plan of attack. But I was not a weak man. I was a master builder who had spent his entire life studying blueprints, anticipating structural failures, and reinforcing weak foundations. Monica thought she was the architect of my demise. She believed she had designed the perfect trap, an inescapable labyrinth of medical bureaucracy and financial manipulation. She thought she was building a cage that would hold me forever, but she had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the ground she was building upon. I sat back, allowing an absolute calm to wash over my exhausted body. I turned off the glowing monitor. I smiled in the dark. I now knew the exact time and place the war would be won. The next morning, I initiated my counteroffensive with the quiet precision of a demolition expert, planting explosive charges. I woke up early, dressed in a sharp suit I had not worn since Evelyn's funeral, and walked out the front door. Monica and Brian were still asleep, completely unaware that the foundation of their grand scheme was about to be obliterated. I drove downtown, navigating the morning traffic with a clear mind. My destination was a sleek, glass-paneled, high-rise building that housed the most ruthless, formidable legal minds in the city. I bypassed the standard family law practitioners and took the elevator directly to the top floor, stepping into the immaculate reception area of Reed & Associates. Mitchell Reed was not a lawyer who handled friendly neighborhood disputes or simple wills. He was a shark in a tailored suit, a man who specialized in high-stakes asset protection, complex estate structuring, and legally annihilating anyone who attempted to breach the financial fortresses he built for his wealthy clients. We had crossed paths a decade ago during a highly contentious commercial land development dispute, and I had witnessed firsthand how he systematically dismantled the opposing counsel with cold, indisputable paperwork. If Monica thought she was a cunning strategist, she had absolutely no idea what kind of predator she was about to invite into her life. Mitchell welcomed me into his expansive corner office, his sharp eyes scanning my face as I sat down. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I opened my leather briefcase and slid the copied appraisal report, the banking documents, and a transcript of the recorded conversation across his massive glass desk. I explained everything. I told him about the forged power of attorney, the fraudulent commercial loan application, and the deeply disturbing medical gaslighting plot Monica had hatched to declare me legally incompetent by the end of the week. Mitchell listened in absolute silence, his expression unreadable. When I finished, he picked up the forged signature page, examining it with cold, clinical detachment. He leaned back in his leather chair and folded his hands together. "They have built a very aggressive strategy, Richard," he said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone. "But their entire plan hinges on one critical structural vulnerability. They assume that you will remain the sole individual proprietor of this real estate asset by the time that forged document reaches the final underwriting desk." I nodded, anticipating his exact line of thought. "And how do we remove that vulnerability, Mitchell? How do we ensure that their forged power of attorney becomes completely useless?" "We remove you from the equation entirely," he replied, a predatory smile touching the corners of his mouth. "We are going to establish an irrevocable trust today. An irrevocable trust is a legal entity that, once created and funded, cannot be modified, amended, or terminated without the explicit permission of the named beneficiaries. But more importantly, once you transfer your assets into this trust, you surrender your individual ownership of those assets. The trust becomes the absolute, indisputable legal owner of the property." He leaned forward, tapping his expensive pen against the glass desk. "Right now, Brian is presenting a power of attorney that grants him control over the assets owned by Richard Foster. But if Richard Foster technically owns nothing, if the house and the bank accounts are legally the property of the Foster Irrevocable Trust, then Brian's forged document is nothing more than a worthless piece of paper. You cannot leverage a property you do not own, and a power of attorney over an individual does not grant authority over a separate, sealed legal entity. We are going to build a vault around your wealth and throw the key into the ocean." For the next 3 hours, we worked meticulously. Mitchell drafted the complex, airtight documents with brutal efficiency. We structured the trust so that I retained the absolute right to reside in the property for the remainder of my natural life, but the legal title was officially transferred away from my personal name. We moved my investment accounts, my retirement funds, and the deed to the $2.1 million house directly into the protective custody of the trust. We named an independent third-party corporate trustee to manage the assets, ensuring that no family member could ever attempt to claim fiduciary control through manipulation or deceit. I signed page after page, watching my life savings transition into an impenetrable legal fortress. But Mitchell was a thorough man, and he knew that Monica's medical trap still posed a significant threat to my personal liberty. "We have secured the property," Richard Mitchell advised, closing the thick leather binder. "But you still need to neutralize this Dr. Clark before the birthday dinner. If they somehow manage to secure a medical declaration of incompetence, they could cause immense bureaucratic chaos, attempt to challenge the timing of this trust, or force you into a state-mandated facility. You need a shield so solid that no corrupt concierge physician can ever pierce it." I shook his hand, thanking him for his ruthless efficiency, and immediately left the law firm. I drove straight across the city to the medical campus of Johns Hopkins Hospital. I had not made an appointment with a standard general practitioner. I had pulled every string and utilized a significant amount of cash to secure an emergency comprehensive evaluation with an independent board of elite, highly respected neurologists and geriatric psychiatrists. The next 5 hours were the most grueling, exhausting test of my endurance I had faced in years. They did not simply ask me what year it was or who the president was. They subjected me to a relentless, rigorous battery of advanced cognitive diagnostics. I sat in brightly lit clinical rooms, identifying complex spatial patterns, memorizing long random sequences of numbers, and solving intricate logic puzzles under extreme time constraints. They tested my short-term recall, my long-term memory retrieval, my executive functioning, and my emotional stability. They hooked me up to an MRI machine scanning the physical structure of my brain to rule out any microscopic signs of decay, atrophy, or early-onset neurodegenerative disease. It was a punishing, relentless marathon designed to break down anyone with even the slightest hint of cognitive decline. But I did not break. I leaned into the discipline that had defined my entire career. I treated every spatial puzzle like a complex architectural blueprint. I treated every memory sequence like a vital materials manifest. I remained sharp-focused and entirely unbothered by the clinical pressure. When the exhaustive testing finally concluded, I sat in the chief neurologist's office waiting for the final verdict. Dr. Aris Thorne, a man whose medical reputation was absolutely unimpeachable, walked into the room holding a thick medical file. He sat behind his desk and looked at me with a genuine, respectful smile. "Mr. Foster," he began, flipping the file open. "We have completed the full spectrum of our neuropsychological and cognitive assessments. I must say, for a man of 70 years, your executive functioning and working memory are quite remarkable. You possess the cognitive elasticity of a man 20 years your junior. There is absolutely no evidence of dementia, Alzheimer's, or any other form of cognitive impairment. You are of perfectly sound mind, with exceptional mental acuity." I let out a slow, deeply satisfying breath. I requested that Dr. Thorne draft a comprehensive sworn medical affidavit detailing his exact findings. I asked him to include the signatures of the 3 other presiding neurologists who had reviewed my scans, effectively creating an indisputable bulletproof wall of elite medical consensus. He handed me the sealed, certified documents complete with the hospital's official insignia. I held the heavy medical file in my hand, feeling the immense, crushing weight of victory. Monica and Brian planned to bring a corrupt, paid-off doctor into my dining room to strip me of my dignity. They had absolutely no idea that I was about to drop the combined medical authority of Johns Hopkins Hospital directly onto their dinner table. I drove back to Mitchell Reed's office as the late afternoon sun began to dip below the city skyline. I handed the sealed medical evaluation to Mitchell. He reviewed the documents, his predatory smile returning in full force. He quickly attached a certified copy of the medical affidavit to the final trust paperwork, solidifying my mental capacity at the exact moment the legal transfer was executed. The timing was now completely unassailable. Mitchell called in his notary public and 2 independent witnesses. I signed the final transfer deeds in front of them, pressing my pen firmly into the paper. I felt the familiar microscopic hesitation on the downward stroke of the R, the organic tremor that made my signature real human and legally binding. Mitchell applied his heavy embosser to the pages, the loud metallic crunch echoing through the quiet office as he officially sealed the irrevocable trust. It was done. The trap was set, the fortress was sealed, and the weapons were fully loaded. I walked out of the high-rise building and stepped into the cool evening air, looking out at the glowing lights of the city. I felt a profound, untouchable sense of calm wash over my tired body. Brian was pacing in my kitchen right now, sweating over a forged document, waiting for the bank to process his grand theft. Monica was busy hiding my car keys and planning her pathetic gaslighting routine, fully believing she held the strings to my psychological destruction. They were entirely oblivious to the catastrophic reality of their situation. Mitchell Reed had sealed the trust. The forged power of attorney was now a worthless piece of paper trying to access an asset I no longer technically owned as an individual. I needed an enforcer, someone who understood the precise mechanics of a criminal takedown. That is where Dedrick came in. A retired city detective turned private investigator, he specialized in white-collar fraud and domestic asset recovery. We met the following morning at a quiet, run-down diner on the industrial side of the city, far away from the polished, pretentious neighborhoods Monica frequented. Dedrick was already sitting in a back booth when I arrived, sipping black coffee and reviewing a thick manila folder. He was a large, imposing man with a thick gray beard and sharp, calculating eyes that missed absolutely nothing. I slid into the vinyl booth across from him, feeling the exhausted ache in my aging bones momentarily fade, replaced by the sharp, focused energy of our impending confrontation. I ordered a simple black coffee and looked directly into his steady eyes. We spent the next hour mapping out the exact logistical sequence for my 70th birthday dinner. Dedrick had already pulled a massive amount of background data on Dr. Arthur Clarke, confirming his history of questionable medical ethics and quiet malpractice settlements. We coordinated the timing perfectly to ensure maximum devastation. Dedrick would have 2 uniformed police officers stationed in an unmarked vehicle just down the street from my house, waiting for my signal to breach the front door. I wanted the element of surprise to be absolute. I wanted Monica and Brian to feel completely secure in their arrogant delusion, right up until the second the steel trap snapped shut around their ankles. We reviewed the floor plan of the dining room, determining exactly where Dedrick would stand when he entered, ensuring nobody could attempt to flee the property through the back kitchen door. Before we parted ways, Dedrick handed me a small, inexpensive smartphone. He explained that he had set up an anonymous, untraceable social media account to monitor my daughter-in-law's highly active digital footprint. Monica was addicted to projecting a flawless image of fabulous wealth, and arrogant criminals who constantly crave public attention always make critical mistakes. Dedrick told me to monitor her posts, searching for any visual confirmation of extravagant spending that we could legally tie to the fraudulent commercial loan application. I took the burner phone back to my basement room that evening. The silence of the large house above me was oppressive, but it was a familiar, comforting companion now. I sat on the edge of my narrow bed, the bright glow of the tiny screen casting long, distorted shadows against the gray concrete walls of my subterranean prison. I opened the application, my thumb hovering over the smooth glass. I had never bothered with social media before, always preferring the tangible reality of wood steel and genuine human connection. Evelyn used to tease me endlessly about my stubborn refusal to adapt to the digital age, often saying I was a man perfectly content to live comfortably in the past. As I tapped the screen, scrolling through the endless curated stream of Monica's manufactured life, a sudden wave of profound sorrow washed over me. I saw hundreds of pictures of her and Brian dining at overpriced restaurants, drinking imported champagne on rented luxury yachts, and posing proudly in front of sleek, high-end sports cars they could never actually afford on their legitimate salaries. Every single gleaming smile, every designer outfit, every extravagant weekend vacation was a complete lie. Their entire fabulous existence was funded by a decaying foundation of lies, manipulation, and stolen money. My money. The money I had earned through 50 years of smashed fingernails, aching joints, and sleepless nights on freezing construction sites. I swiped past a recent photo of Brian wearing a custom-tailored suit, looking exactly like the highly successful tech entrepreneur he so desperately pretended to be. He was a hollow shell of a man, trading his fundamental integrity for the fleeting validation of complete strangers on the internet. I kept scrolling, moving backward through the digital timeline of their fraudulent existence, absorbing the sheer magnitude of their complex deception. I was looking for hidden patterns, recognizable locations, and identifying details, anything that could further solidify the massive criminal case Dedrick was methodically building in the shadows to destroy their lives completely. Then my thumb froze on the glass screen. I stopped cold, my breath catching painfully in my throat. I stared intensely at the glowing monitor, my aging heart pounding a slow, heavy beat against my ribs. It was a professionally lit photograph, posted late on a Saturday night, roughly 2 weeks after Monica had violently gutted Evelyn's reading room and banished me to the dark basement. The location tag clearly indicated an exclusive invite-only charity gala hosted at a prominent downtown art museum. Monica was standing right in the center of the glittering frame, wearing a stunning floor-length emerald green evening gown. She looked radiant, powerful, and absolutely untouchable. But my furious eyes were not drawn to her expensive dress, her perfect makeup, or her bright, arrogant, victorious smile radiating through the screen. My gaze was locked entirely on her bare neck, resting perfectly against her delicate collarbone, catching the blinding flash of the professional camera was a breathtaking, unmistakable string of antique pearls. They were Evelyn's grandmother's pearls. The exact same pearls that had been carefully secured inside the vintage walnut jewelry box, the wooden box Monica had ruthlessly stolen from the upstairs reading room and casually dismissed as a cleaning crew error during our tense dinner. The pearls were entirely unique, featuring a handcrafted solid gold clasp shaped perfectly, like a small, delicate rose. It was a specific, unforgettable detail I had stared at for over 40 years, every single time I lovingly helped my wife fasten them around her neck before a special evening out. There was absolutely no mistaking them for anything else in this world. Monica was parading my dead wife's precious heirloom around a crowded room full of wealthy strangers. She was wearing the stolen jewelry like a shiny, victorious trophy, celebrating her triumphant deception and her utter domination over my household. I looked just below the glowing photograph, forcing myself to read the sickening caption she had proudly typed underneath for the entire world to see. It read simply, "Spoiled by my amazing husband." The sheer disrespect of that short caption struck me squarely in the chest with the force of a physical blow. Brian had not spoiled her. He had spinelessly permitted her to grave rob his own mother's sanctuary, turning a beloved family heirloom into a cheap prop for her insatiable social media vanity. He had allowed his wife to literally wear his mother's stolen legacy. A cold, paralyzing fury settled deep into my tired bones, instantly freezing any pathetic trace of paternal mercy I might have unknowingly harbored for my cowardly son. The last fragile thread connecting my heart to Brian snapped, completely severing any remaining bond between us. I did not scream in anger. I did not violently throw the burner phone against the cinder block wall of the basement. Decades of steady discipline prevented me from losing control. I calmly took several digital screenshots of the infuriating photograph, ensuring the upload date, the museum location tag, and the grotesque caption were permanently preserved. I immediately emailed the digital evidence directly to Dedrick and Mitchell Reed, knowing this would guarantee an arrest warrant. I then stood up, grabbed my heavy winter coat, and marched straight up the creaking wooden basement stairs without hesitation. I walked out into the freezing night air, climbed into the cab of my old truck, and turned the ignition key. I drove directly to the Central Police Precinct, navigating the empty city streets with an absolute sense of purpose. The fluorescent lights of the police station lobby buzzed overhead as I confidently approached the front desk. I requested to speak with an available detective, my voice devoid of any emotion, steady and cold as carved granite. I sat in a sterile interview room and presented the time-stamped digital photographs to a serious officer, explaining exactly what the pearls represented and how they had vanished from my home. I looked the detective directly in the eyes, my resolve unbreakable, and I officially filed a formal grand larceny police report against my own daughter-in-law. The detective listened carefully, typing the details into his computer database. I handed over the digital files, ensuring every piece of metadata was securely transferred into the official police record. He assured me the warrant would be finalized shortly. I walked back out to my truck, the freezing wind stinging my face. The trap was finally complete. They believed they were setting a medical snare for a weak, confused old man. They were entirely wrong. I was fully prepared to burn their entire fraudulent world down to the ground. I climbed into my bed and closed my eyes, waiting patiently for the upcoming birthday dinner to begin. The days leading up to Thursday passed with an agonizing slowness, but I remained perfectly disciplined in my performance. I shuffled through the hallways, asked the same questions twice, and stared blankly out the kitchen window whenever Brian or Monica entered. I was laying the foundation for their grand illusion, giving them exactly what they needed to feel confident. When the evening of my 70th birthday arrived, the house was filled with the rich, deceptive aroma of roasted beef and baked potatoes. It smelled like a loving home, a cruel juxtaposition to the calculated ambush waiting for me in the dining room. I dressed slowly in my basement room, putting on a clean but slightly wrinkled button-down shirt and a pair of faded slacks. I needed to look like a man who was slowly losing his grip on daily maintenance. I climbed the wooden stairs, my breathing shallow, and stepped into the brightly lit foyer. The scene unfolding in my dining room was a masterful display of theatrical deception. Brian was pouring expensive red wine into crystal glasses, his hands trembling just enough to betray his underlying panic. Patricia sat near the fireplace, complaining loudly about the evening chill while sipping her drink. Standing next to Monica, projecting an aura of professional authority, was Dr. Arthur Clark. He was a tall, polished man with silver hair and a fraudulent, reassuring smile plastered across his face. Monica rushed to greet me, her voice dripping with a sugary sweetness that made my stomach churn. "Happy birthday, Rick," she announced, linking her arm through mine with forced, uncomfortable intimacy. "Look who came to celebrate your milestone. This is Arthur, an old dear friend of mine. He was just in the neighborhood and wanted to pay his respects." I offered the doctor a weak handshake, allowing my grip to feel frail and uncertain. He looked at me with the clinical gaze of a predator evaluating a wounded animal. We moved toward the center of the room and took our seats around the solid oak dining table. I had constructed this table by hand over 20 years ago, selecting the thickest cuts of premium timber. It was designed to endure, anchored by iron-bolted legs that could easily withstand the weight of a dozen family members. Tonight, however, it served as the unyielding battleground for my own survival. I sat at the head of the table, a position of traditional authority that now felt like an illuminated interrogation chair. Monica sat to my immediate left, perfectly positioned to control the flow of the conversation. Dr. Clark took the seat directly across from her, giving him an unobstructed view of my face and physical movements. Patricia positioned herself next to the doctor, her gaudy jewelry clinking noisily against the fine porcelain plates. Brian sat at the opposite end of the table, as far away from me as physically possible, hiding behind a large floral centerpiece so he would not have to look his father in the eyes. The atmosphere in the room was incredibly suffocating. It was a gathering of vultures circling a dying man, politely waiting for his final breath before fighting over the remaining scraps of flesh. They spoke to me in slow, patronizing tones, over-enunciating their words as if I were a very young, slow child, rather than a seasoned, retired master builder. Patricia leaned across the table, her voice artificially loud. "Are you managing the stairs all right these days, Richard?" She asked, a fake grimace of sympathy, wrinkling her heavily powdered face. "Monica tells me you have been spending almost all of your time down in the basement. You really must be careful with those old knees. A bad fall at your age can be absolutely devastating to your overall cognitive health." I nodded slowly, staring down at my empty porcelain plate, maintaining the perfect submissive silence of a defeated elder. My gaze drifted slowly from Patricia's mocking face to the empty wooden chair situated directly to my right. It was Evelyn's chair. For 4 decades, my beautiful wife had sat in that exact spot, her bright laughter filling the room, her gentle hand occasionally reaching out to squeeze my arm beneath the table. The sharp physical absence of her presence was a heavy ache in my chest, but tonight I did not let the grief weaken me. Instead, I drew an immense, unbreakable strength from her memory. I remembered the fierce, protective fire in her eyes whenever anyone tried to take advantage of our family. I knew exactly what she would say if she were sitting next to me right now. She would tell me to hold my ground, to let them expose their absolute worst, and to burn their treacherous plans to the ground without a single ounce of mercy. Channeling her fierce spirit, I continued to play my pathetic part to absolute perfection. When Monica served the roasted beef, I intentionally fumbled with my heavy silver fork, allowing it to clatter loudly against the edge of my porcelain plate. I reached for my crystal water glass with a slight exaggerated tremor in my wrist, spilling a few cold drops onto the pristine white linen tablecloth. "Oh, Dad, let me help you with that," Brian said quickly, his voice tight and unnaturally high-pitched, as he tossed a napkin across the table. Dr. Clark watched the entire manufactured interaction with intense clinical interest. I saw him discreetly reach into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pull out a small leather-bound notepad and a sleek silver pen. He laid them flat on the table right next to his wine glass, ready to document every single manufactured flaw, every rehearsed stumble, and every staged moment of confusion. The dinner progressed in an agonizingly slow, calculated rhythm. The conversation flowed around me, carefully constructed to isolate me and highlight my supposed decline. Monica would bring up a recent news event, and before I could even formulate a basic response, she would loudly answer for me, explaining to the table that I simply did not follow current events anymore because it was all too confusing for my tired brain. Brian remained a cowardly, silent participant in his own home, eagerly drinking his red wine and staring rigidly at his plate while his wife systematically dismantled his father's dignity in front of a corrupt medical professional. I chewed my food mechanically, tasting absolutely nothing, my mind operating with the cold, precise efficiency of a ticking clock. I knew exactly what they were doing. They were laying the psychological groundwork, establishing the undeniable premise of my incompetence before initiating the final devastating ambush. Dr. Clark leaned forward, resting his elbows on the polished oak. "Richard, Monica tells me you had a very long and successful career in commercial construction," he said, his tone smooth and conversational. "That kind of complex, high-stress work must have taken quite a severe toll on you. Do you find it difficult to manage your daily schedule, now that you are fully retired? It is quite common for men with highly active, demanding careers to experience a rapid cognitive plateau once the daily structural routine is completely removed from their lives." I looked at the corrupt doctor, my face a mask of mild, harmless confusion. "I suppose I do forget the small things from time to time," I mumbled, quietly staring down at my hands. "Just normal old age, I guess." The doctor smiled a cold, empty expression and jotted down a quick, decisive note in his leather journal. The main course was cleared away, and the suffocating tension in the dining room reached an absolute unbearable peak. Monica stood up from her chair, her green dress rustling softly against the hardwood floor. She walked toward the grand mahogany sideboard, her movements deliberate and predatory. As she passed behind my chair, she smoothly, almost invisibly reached down and slipped my gold-rimmed reading glasses right out of my front shirt pocket. She seamlessly dropped them into a decorative ceramic bowl resting on the far side of the room. She returned to the table, empty-handed, sitting back down, with a bright, terrifyingly vicious smile stretching across her face. She poured herself another glass of red wine, her eyes locking directly onto mine with malicious intent. "Now, Rick," she said, her voice echoing sharply through the sudden heavy silence of the dining room. "I wanted to read you the beautiful card Brian bought, but I cannot seem to find it. Do you have your reading glasses handy?" I reached up to touch my empty shirt pocket, my fingers brushing against the bare cotton fabric. Monica tilted her head, her smile widening into a wicked sneer as she prepared to deliver the final psychological strike. "Why are you always losing your things lately?" "Rick," she asked, her voice dripping with fake, exaggerated concern for Dr. Clark to document. "Are you finally starting to lose your memory completely?" I patted my empty shirt pocket, allowing a look of mild, helpless panic to wash over my face. I patted my slacks, acting exactly like a confused man who could not understand where his belongings had vanished to. "I do not know," I muttered, letting my voice waver perfectly. I was absolutely certain I had them right here just a moment ago. I suppose I might have left them upstairs on the nightstand. Monica let out a theatrical sigh, looking across the table at Dr. Clark. "This happens every single day now, Arthur," she said, her voice laced with mock tragedy. "He loses his keys and wanders around the hallways at night, looking for rooms that do not exist. We are just so incredibly worried about his safety living in this massive house." I looked at Brian, giving my son one last desperate opportunity to intervene, to speak the truth and stop this horrific farce. Brian stared intensely at his half-empty plate of roasted beef, his jaw clenched tight, absolutely refusing to defend his own father. His silence confirmed his total betrayal. Dr. Clark cleared his throat, leaning his frame forward across the oak table in a pose of clinical empathy. "Richard," he began, his voice a low, soothing hum, designed entirely to disarm and manipulate. "Aging is a very complex, very difficult process for all of us. There is no shame in admitting when the mental load becomes too heavy. Tell me, Richard, how have you been feeling lately? Have you been experiencing periods of prolonged confusion or sudden disorientation?" I kept my head bowed, staring at the polished wood grain of the table I had built. "I am just a little tired," I replied purposefully, injecting a slight halting stammer into my sentence structure. "The days just seem to blend together sometimes since my wife passed away." "The house is very quiet." The doctor offered a sympathetic nod, though his eyes remained as cold as a striking viper. "That is perfectly understandable, Richard," he said smoothly. "Grief can certainly cloud the mind. But Monica tells me you have been struggling with basic routines. Let us try a simple cognitive exercise to see where we are standing. Can you tell me what day it is today, and perhaps what you had for breakfast this morning?" It was a rudimentary baseline evaluation. I let a long, uncomfortable silence stretch across the dining room, pretending to struggle immensely with the simple query. I furrowed my brow, tapping my fingers against the table. "Well," I stammered, stretching out the syllables. "It is Thursday, I believe." "Yes, Thursday. And for breakfast I think I had oatmeal. Or maybe it was toast. I cannot quite recall right now. My memory is just a bit foggy this evening." Monica pounced on the intentional hesitation, like a starving predator. "You see, Arthur," she interrupted loudly, pointing a manicured finger at me. "He does not even remember that he skipped breakfast, because he could not operate the coffee machine. He just stood in the kitchen staring at the buttons for 20 minutes. It is heartbreaking to watch his mind deteriorate so rapidly." I looked at Monica, absorbing her fabricated reality. There was no confusion with the coffee machine. I drank my coffee black from a simple French press I kept down in the basement. She was weaving pure fiction, layering lie upon lie to construct a narrative of my total incompetence. Dr. Clark pulled his notepad closer, unscrewing his sleek silver pen with a metallic click. He began to write furiously, documenting every manufactured flaw and every staged hesitation. "Richard," he continued, his tone growing more authoritative, more clinical. "When memory begins to fail at this specific rate, it becomes highly dangerous for a senior individual to maintain control over complicated, high-stress responsibilities. Financial management, property ownership, and large-scale asset allocation require a level of cognitive sharpness that you appear to be rapidly losing. It is crucial that you have responsible family members step in to protect you from making catastrophic financial errors." I turned my gaze to my son. "Brian," I said, allowing a tremor of genuine pain to enter my voice, though it was born from heartbreak, not dementia. "Brian, you know I manage my affairs perfectly well. Tell the doctor. Tell him I handle my own accounts. Tell him I am fine." I waited, the silence in the room thickening into a suffocating, unbearable weight. I watched the internal battle play out across Brian's sweating face. He knew I was perfectly sane. He knew he was actively participating in the psychological execution of his own father for a line of credit. He gripped the stem of his wine glass so tightly, I thought the fragile crystal might shatter directly into his palm. He looked up, his eyes meeting mine for the first time all evening. The cowardice I saw reflecting in his pupils made my stomach churn. "Dad," he muttered, his voice weak and pathetic. "You have been slipping lately. You know you have. You forgot to pay the water bill last month, and you keep mixing up our names. It is getting worse, Dad. We just want to make sure you are safe. We are doing this because we love you." It was the ultimate betrayal. He had fully committed to the script. He was willing to bury me alive in a legal tomb to save his failing software company. Patricia scoffed loudly from her seat near the fireplace, taking a large gulp of her red wine. "It is a tragedy, really," she chimed in, waving her hand dismissively in my direction. "But it happens to the best of us. The mind goes, the body follows, and the family has to make the tough, necessary choices. You should just sign the papers, Richard, and let the young people handle the heavy lifting. You can just relax in the basement and not worry about a single thing ever again." Dr. Clark nodded in solemn agreement, tapping his silver pen against the crisp white paper of his medical journal. He looked at Brian and Monica with a deeply serious, practiced expression of medical concern. "Based on my preliminary observation this evening, coupled with the detailed behavioral history you both have provided, I am officially observing significant, undeniable markers of advanced cognitive decline," he stated, his voice ringing with fraudulent authority. "There is a clear pattern of severe short-term memory loss, spatial disorientation, and an inability to track basic reality. Given his advanced age and his obvious state of mental fragility, it is my professional medical opinion that Richard Foster is no longer legally competent to govern his own estate or make binding financial decisions." I watched the doctor's hand move gracefully across the page. I knew exactly what he was doing. He was writing the preliminary diagnostic statement. He was drafting the exact medical language required by the bank's compliance division to trigger the guardianship clause hidden deep within the forged power of attorney document. He was handing Monica and Brian the absolute, undeniable key to my $2.1 million home. Monica leaned back in her chair, a look of pure, unadulterated ecstasy washing over her face. She had won. In her mind, she had successfully executed the perfect crime. She had stolen my sanctuary, she had stolen my wife's jewelry, and now she was stealing my fundamental legal autonomy right in front of my face. "We are so grateful for your professional insight, Arthur," she said, her voice practically trembling with suppressed joy. "We will need you to sign a formal affidavit with those exact medical findings so we can present it to our family lawyer first thing tomorrow morning. We just want to ensure his assets are securely managed during this tragic decline." Dr. Clark offered her a reassuring, conspiratorial smile. "I can draft the official medical affidavit right now, Monica. I will sign it, date it, and provide my medical license number for your legal counsel to verify. It is the responsible thing to do for his own safety." He uncapped his sleek silver pen once more, preparing to sign the bottom of the page. I slowly reached out with my right hand and picked up my crystal wine glass from the polished oak table. My fingers did not tremble. There was no hesitation, no weakness, no fragile stammer in my movement. I brought the rim to my lips and took a slow, deep, deliberate sip of the dark red wine. I lowered the glass, placing it back onto the table with a firm, solid, highly intentional click. The sharp sound made Dr. Clark pause, his silver pen hovering a millimeter above his notepad. I took a deep, steadying breath. I let my shoulders pull back. I felt the manufactured stoop completely leave my spine. I lifted my chin, locking my jaw. My entire physical demeanor shifted in a fraction of a second. The tired, confused, fragile old man facade vanished instantly, completely replaced by the cold, calculating master builder ready to finally destroy their lives. The silence in the dining room became absolute heavy, with a sudden, terrifying shift in the atmospheric pressure. I did not speak at first. I simply let them look at me. I let them see the clarity in my eyes, the steadiness of my posture, and the complete absence of the dementia they had so gleefully diagnosed just seconds prior. Brian stopped breathing. Monica's victorious smile froze on her face, slowly fracturing at the edges as her brain struggled to comprehend the visual data it was receiving. Dr. Clark lowered his sleek silver pen, the ink never touching the crisp paper of his fraudulent medical affidavit. He recognized the shift immediately. A man suffering from advanced cognitive decline does not possess the piercing predatory focus that I was now radiating across the solid oak table. I calmly reached down my hand, slipping beneath the hidden lip of my dining chair, where I had secured my ammunition hours before they even arrived. My fingers wrapped around thick, reinforced paper. I pulled my arm back up and dropped a massive, heavily overstuffed manila envelope directly onto the polished wood. It landed with a loud, resounding thud that echoed like a gunshot through the quiet room. Patricia jumped in her seat, clutching her wineglass to her chest. Brian physically recoiled, pressing his back hard against his chair. The envelope sat in the dead center of the table, a physical manifestation of their impending doom. I reached out and untied the string closure, my movements smooth, practiced, and entirely deliberate. I slid my hand inside and pulled out the first stack of documents. They were printed on heavy premium paper bearing the unmistakable embossed seal of Johns Hopkins Hospital. I separated the thick medical file and slid it smoothly across the mahogany surface directly toward Dr. Clark. He did not want to touch it, but his eyes were drawn to the bold hospital insignia. "Go ahead, Arthur," I said, my voice dropping into a low, resonant register that commanded the room. "Read it." "That is a comprehensive neuropsychological and cognitive evaluation conducted just 3 days ago by a board of 4 independent elite neurologists at Johns Hopkins. It includes a full functional MRI, extensive psychological testing, and a sworn medical affidavit, confirming that I possess the cognitive elasticity of a healthy 50-year-old man. There is absolutely zero evidence of dementia, Alzheimer's disease, or any other cognitive impairment." Dr. Clark's face drained of all color, transforming into a sickly ashen gray. His polished exterior melted away instantly, revealing nothing but a frightened, greedy little man whose career had just reached its terminal endpoint. He slowly picked up the document, his eyes scanning the signatures of the prominent medical professionals who outranked him in every conceivable metric. "If you sign that piece of paper on your notepad," I continued, my tone slicing through the air like a scalpel, "you will not just lose your medical license. You will face criminal charges for medical fraud, conspiracy to commit elder abuse, and falsifying medical records for financial gain. I have heavily encrypted audio recordings of Monica explaining exactly how she brought you here tonight to intentionally gaslight me into a fake diagnosis. My lawyers are already preparing to forward everything to the state medical board by tomorrow morning." The doctor dropped the file as if it had suddenly caught fire. He pushed his chair back, his breathing ragged, looking desperately at Monica as the reality of his destroyed career crashed down upon him. He was neutralized, completely removed from their chessboard. I reached back into the manila envelope and pulled out the second stack of paperwork. This stack was even thicker, bound by a dark blue legal cover. I looked down the length of the table at my son. Brian was sweating profusely, a single bead of perspiration rolling down his temple. I remembered a time when he was just a little boy, full of promise and bright potential. Now, looking at the pathetic, cowardly criminal sitting across from me, I felt absolutely nothing. I slid the heavy legal binder down the oak table until it stopped perfectly in front of his empty dinner plate. Alongside it, I tossed a pristine, high-definition photocopy of the power of attorney document he had submitted to the bank. "You thought you were so clever, Brian," I said, my voice devoid of any paternal warmth. "You forged my signature perfectly. You captured the slant, the loop, the crossing of the letter T. But you forgot that you do not know me anymore. You did not know about the microscopic tremor in my right hand, the slight hesitation on the downward stroke of the letter R. The bank manager might have missed it, but the forensic handwriting expert my lawyers hired certainly did not." Brian stared at the forged document, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish unable to formulate a single coherent word. I tapped my finger firmly against the dark blue legal binder sitting in front of him. But the forgery is not even the worst part of your situation, Brian, I explained, watching his eyes widen in terror. You see, you submitted that forged document to secure a massive commercial loan against this property. You tried to use this house as collateral to save your failing technology startup. The problem is, you cannot leverage an asset that does not belong to me. Monica gasped sharply, her hands flying to her mouth. What are you talking about? She demanded, her voice shrill and panicked. Your name is on the deed. We saw the public records. We know you own this house. My name was on the deed, I corrected her, savoring the absolute destruction of their master plan. 3 days ago, I sat down with Mitchell Reed, the most ruthless trust attorney in this city. I executed an irrevocable trust and transferred the deed of this house along with every single investment account and major asset I possess directly into it. I no longer own this house as an individual. The trust owns it, and the trust is managed by an independent corporate board. I leaned forward, locking my gaze onto my son's terrified face. Do you understand what that means, Brian? It means that when you submitted a forged power of attorney to that bank to extract a $2.1 million commercial line of credit against an asset I do not legally own, you committed federal wire fraud. You committed bank fraud. You crossed state financial lines with forged documents in an attempt to secure commercial funding under completely false pretenses. You are looking at decades in a federal penitentiary. Brian began to shake violently, his hands gripping the edge of the table as if the floor was dropping out from underneath him. He looked at the trust documents, seeing his entire future disintegrating into ash. Patricia sat frozen by the fireplace, her wineglass slipping from her fingers and shattering against the hardwood floor. She made no move to clean it up, entirely paralyzed by the unfolding catastrophe that had just swallowed her daughter's grand lifestyle. I was not finished. I reached into the manila envelope one last time and pulled out a single sheet of glossy photographic paper, along with a carbon copy of an official municipal police report. I turned my attention to my daughter-in-law. Monica was breathing heavily, her chest heaving as she frantically searched the room for an escape route that simply did not exist. I slid the photograph and the police report smoothly across the table until they rested directly under her nose. It was the screenshot of her Instagram post. The high-definition image of her standing at the charity gala wearing her emerald green evening gown and proudly displaying Evelyn's vintage pearl necklace against her collarbone. The caption, "Spoiled by my amazing husband," was printed clearly at the bottom. The irony of her own vanity sealing her fate was almost too perfect to put into words. You thought I would not notice, I said softly, the quiet intensity of my voice carrying more danger than a scream. You thought you could pack my wife's memories into cheap garbage bags, steal her grandmother's heirloom pearls from a hidden walnut box, and parade them around the city like a shiny trophy. You thought I was too blind, too old, and too foolish to check my own home. Monica stared at the photograph, her face draining of the smug arrogance she had worn like impenetrable armor since the day she moved in. Rick, I just borrowed them, she whispered, her voice cracking with sudden overwhelming fear. I was going to put them back. I swear to you, I was going to put them back in her room eventually. You did not borrow them, Monica, I stated coldly. You stole them during a calculated invasion of my property. Those pearls are appraised at over $30,000. That makes this a felony charge of grand larceny. That piece of paper sitting next to your photograph is the official stamped police report I filed 48 hours ago. I handed over all the metadata, the location tags, and the exact timestamp of your public confession. There is a warrant out for your arrest right now. The dining room descended into a chaotic, suffocating panic. Dr. Clark was frantically shoving his notepad into his pocket, murmuring desperate apologies as he backed away from the table trying to save himself. Patricia was weeping silently, her hands covering her face. Monica sat completely frozen, staring at the police report, as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike. Brian finally found his voice. He pushed himself up from his chair, his knees knocking against the heavy wood of the table. His face was stained with sweat and tears, the ultimate portrait of a cowardly man facing the devastating consequences of his own greed. Dad, please, Brian stammers, his hands reaching out toward me across the long expanse of mahogany. Dad, we can explain this. Please, just listen to me. We can fix this. I raised my hand, cutting him off instantly with a single sharp gesture. The time for explanations had passed days ago. The time for mercy had died the moment they stuffed my wife's life into a black plastic bag. This house isn't a democracy, Brian, I said, my voice ringing out with absolute undeniable finality. It's a dictatorship. As the words left my mouth, intense, blinding flashes of red and blue lights suddenly erupted through the large dining room windows, painting the terrified faces of my family in the harsh, flashing colors of impending justice. The heavy, authoritative pounding on the solid oak front door resonated through the silent house, vibrating against the floorboards beneath our feet. 3 loud, distinct knocks signaled the absolute end of their elaborate, deceitful masquerade. Before Brian or Monica could even attempt to stand and see who was interrupting their carefully orchestrated medical trap, the front door swung wide open. I had intentionally left the deadbolt unlatched, specifically for this exact moment. Dedrick stepped into the brightly lit foyer, his imposing broad frame casting a long, dark shadow across the polished hardwood floor. He was not alone. 2 uniformed police officers flanked him, their heavy utility belts clinking softly in the sudden, suffocating quiet of the home. The officers moved with a practiced, deliberate efficiency, stepping past the grand staircase and moving directly into the formal dining room. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. The thick, oppressive arrogance that Monica and Patricia had carried with them all evening evaporated completely, replaced by the sharp, metallic scent of genuine panic. The flashing red and blue lights from the police cruisers parked out on the street continued to sweep across the dining room walls, illuminating the terrified, pale faces of the people who had so casually tried to bury me alive. Dr. Clark was the very first person to physically react to the sudden police presence. The corrupt, polished physician realized instantly that the situation had escalated far beyond a simple family dispute over a lucrative real estate asset. He saw the glint of the silver badges, and his survival instincts kicked into absolute overdrive. He slowly pushed his dining chair backward, keeping his hands visible, but inching his body toward the arched doorway that led to the kitchen and the back exit. He kept his head lowered desperately, hoping the officers would focus entirely on Monica and Brian, allowing him to quietly slip out the back door and somehow salvage his crumbling medical career. He did not make it past the mahogany sideboard. One of the uniformed officers stepped smoothly into his path, blocking the exit with his solid, unyielding frame. Dr. Clark stammered, raising his hands in a pathetic gesture of defensive innocence. "Officer, there has been a terrible misunderstanding here." The doctor stuttered, his smooth, reassuring bedside manner completely shattering into pieces. "I am just a guest in this house. A simple family friend invited over for a birthday dinner. I have absolutely no involvement in whatever financial matters are being discussed at this table tonight." Dedrick stepped forward, his sharp investigative eyes locking onto the trembling physician. "You are Dr. Arthur Clark." Dedrick stated, his voice a deep, resonant rumble that demanded absolute immediate compliance. "You were brought here tonight to perform an unlicensed fraudulent medical evaluation on Mr. Foster to unlawfully activate a guardianship clause. We have sworn affidavits, encrypted audio recordings of the conspiracy being planned, and your own preliminary medical notes sitting right there on the table." The police officer placed a heavy, authoritative hand on Dr. Clark's tailored shoulder. "You are being detained for formal questioning regarding your participation in a conspiracy to commit medical fraud and elder abuse," the officer informed him calmly. The doctor's face crumpled into a pathetic mask of pure terror as the officer firmly guided him out of the dining room and toward the front door, removing the first treacherous piece from their rapidly collapsing chessboard. With the corrupt doctor swiftly removed from the equation, the full devastating weight of the law turned its attention toward the primary architects of the grand deception. Monica shot up from her chair, the emerald green fabric of her expensive evening dress rustling loudly in the tense, unbroken silence. She pointed a manicured, trembling finger directly at my face, her voice rising to a shrill, hysterical pitch that grated painfully against my ears. "This is completely insane," she screamed, looking wildly between me and the remaining police officer standing near the table. "This is a complete and total fabrication. He is a confused, vindictive, senile old man making up ridiculous lies because he is angry about a simple misunderstanding over a piece of jewelry. I did not steal anything from his wife's room. I merely borrowed those pearls to wear to a charity event, and I was going to return them to his nightstand tomorrow morning. You cannot possibly arrest me for borrowing a family heirloom from my own father-in-law." Dedrick did not argue with her frantic, desperate, twisting logic. He simply reached into the inner pocket of his heavy winter jacket and retrieved a neatly folded official legal document. He unfolded the crisp white paper and held it up so she could clearly see the bold black text and the unmistakable authoritative signature of a municipal judge stamped at the very bottom. "This is a court-ordered search warrant for the master bedroom, currently occupied by you and your husband." Dedrick explained, his voice entirely devoid of sympathy, warmth, or emotion. "We are legally authorized to search the premises and recover a vintage walnut jewelry box containing an antique pearl necklace and a diamond anniversary band, items reported as grand larceny by the sole legal owner of this property." The color drained entirely from Monica's face, leaving her looking like a hollow, fragile porcelain doll. She staggered backward, her knees hitting the edge of her dining chair, as the undeniable reality of the search warrant finally pierced through her impenetrable armor of extreme entitlement. She knew exactly where the jewelry box was hidden. She knew that the police would find it securely tucked away among her expensive designer shoes in the very back of her walk-in closet within a matter of minutes. The undeniable physical evidence of her malicious crime was sitting right upstairs, waiting patiently to seal her devastating fate. The uniformed officer stepped toward her, unfastening the heavy metal handcuffs from his leather utility belt. The sharp, metallic clinking sound echoed clearly through the dining room, a terrible final melody that signified the complete destruction of her meticulously curated, luxurious lifestyle. "Monica Foster." The officer stated, his voice cutting clearly through her escalating, panicked sobs. "You are being placed under arrest for grand larceny and for your involvement in a conspiracy to commit federal wire fraud." Monica began to thrash her arms frantically, shaking her head violently from side to side as the officer gently but firmly grabbed her wrists and pulled them behind her back. "No, you cannot do this to me!" she wailed, hot tears streaming down her face and completely ruining her immaculate, expensive makeup. "Brian, tell them to stop. Tell them I did not do anything wrong. Do not just sit there and let them take me away like a common criminal." But Brian was utterly paralyzed, glued to his wooden chair, as he watched the heavy steel cuffs click securely shut around his wife's delicate wrists. The officer smoothly turned her around to face the hallway and began to recite the Miranda rights with practiced mechanical precision. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you." Monica's arrogant, commanding presence was completely, irreversibly gone. The demanding queen of the household had been reduced to a weeping, profoundly humiliated criminal. Her fabulous facade entirely shattered by the cold, heavy reality of the metal bracelets binding her hands tightly together behind her back. Patricia sat frozen by the stone fireplace, her hands clamped tightly over her mouth, completely incapable of intervening, as she watched her precious daughter being escorted out of the house in utter, undeniable disgrace. As the heavy front door closed behind Monica and the arresting officer, the silence in the dining room became thick and suffocating. The flashing red and blue lights continued to paint the walls, casting long, erratic shadows across the polished oak table and the remnants of our birthday dinner. I stood at the head of the table, perfectly still, my breathing steady and my posture completely rigid. I looked down the length of the wood at my son. The false confidence, the deceptive bravado, and the arrogant delusion had been entirely stripped away from his weak character. Brian slowly pushed his chair back and stumbled weakly to his feet. His legs seemed entirely incapable of supporting his body weight. He took 2 shaking steps toward me and then collapsed heavily onto his knees right on the hardwood floor. He looked up at me, his face twisted in absolute agony, salty tears spilling freely from his widened eyes. The polished floorboards beneath him offered absolutely no comfort. "Dad." "Please," Brian begged, his voice cracking into a pathetic, desperate sob. "Please, you have to stop this. You have to call them off right now. I am your son. Remember when we used to build model airplanes in the garage together on Sunday afternoons? Remember how you taught me to throw a baseball in the backyard when I was just a little boy? We are blood. We are family. You are my father. You cannot do this to me. You cannot just let them take everything from us. We can fix the documents. We can make the bank accounts right again. I promise I will do whatever you want me to do from now on." I looked down at my son, still kneeling on the solid oak floorboards I had laid with my own 2 hands decades ago. He was weeping openly, salty tears tracking through the light sheen of sweat on his pale cheeks. He clutched at the fabric of my trousers, his knuckles white with the sheer, desperate panic of a man who realized the ground beneath his feet had completely vanished. He weaponized those precious childhood memories, wielding the images of model airplanes and backyard baseball games like a shield, hoping to strike a chord of paternal mercy deep within my chest. He desperately wanted me to see the innocent little boy he once was rather than the calculating criminal he had chosen to become. But as I stared down at his trembling form, I felt absolutely no pity. I felt no anger. I felt no lingering trace of the fiery rage that had propelled me through the last few agonizing weeks. I felt only a vast, echoing, cold emptiness. The space in my heart where my unconditional love for him had previously resided was now a hollow, abandoned cavity. I slowly reached down and firmly pried his sweating fingers away from the fabric of my pants, stepping back to break the physical contact between us. "You ask me to remember the little boy who built airplanes in the garage," I said, my voice steady, quiet, and completely devoid of any emotional warmth. "I remember that boy perfectly, Brian. I remember how his eyes used to light up when he finished painting a wing, and how he always wanted to do things the right way. I loved that boy with every single fiber of my being. But looking at you right now cowering on the floor because your malicious financial crimes have finally caught up with you, I know that little boy is dead. You killed him the moment you decided my life savings were your personal emergency fund. You buried him the moment you forged my signature on a commercial loan application. And you completely erased his memory the moment you sat at this dining table and actively participated in a coordinated psychological execution to strip me of my fundamental legal autonomy." Brian let out a ragged, agonizing wail, his forehead dropping to rest against the cold, hardwood floor. He curled his body inward, wrapping his arms around his own torso, as if trying to physically hold his crumbling reality together. He had spent his entire adult life bouncing from one financial disaster to the next, always secure in the absolute certainty that I would eventually step in with my checkbook and my construction tools to repair the damage. He had always operated under the arrogant, deeply ingrained delusion that consequences were things that happened to other people, to lesser people who did not live in prestigious neighborhoods or drive leased luxury vehicles. Now facing the immovable, terrifying wall of the federal justice system, the psychological shock was entirely shattering his mind. He was beginning to understand that there was no checkbook large enough to bail him out of a federal wire fraud indictment. While Brian was sobbing uncontrollably on the floor, my peripheral vision caught a sudden, stealthy movement near the archway leading out of the dining room. Patricia had realized that the entire grand illusion had collapsed, and she was desperately attempting to use the intense emotional distraction of her son-in-law's breakdown to engineer a quiet escape. She had slipped out of her dining chair, her expensive high heels discarded on the carpet, so she could walk silently in her stocking feet. She was creeping along the edge of the hallway, her eyes locked on the grand staircase. She intended to scurry up to Evelyn's former reading room, throw her designer clothes into her suitcases, and slip out the back door before the authorities realized she was heavily implicated in the massive conspiracy. She did not even make it to the first wooden step. Dedrick, the seasoned former detective, had anticipated her cowardly maneuver from the exact moment he walked through the front door. He detached himself from the shadows of the foyer, with terrifying silent speed, stepping squarely into the center of the hallway and completely blocking her path to the staircase. Patricia gasped sharply, stumbling backward as she collided with his broad, imposing frame. She clutched the lapels of her trench coat, her heavily powdered face twisting into a mask of indignant, aristocratic outrage. She immediately tried to weaponize her perceived social status, puffing out her chest and adopting her shrill, demanding tone. "Move out of my way." This instant, she commanded, her voice shaking, despite her attempts to sound authoritative. "I am a guest in this house. I have absolutely nothing to do with whatever ridiculous banking issues are going on here. I am an innocent bystander, and I demand to be allowed to gather my personal belongings and return to my own home immediately. You have no legal right to detain an elderly woman who was merely invited over for a family birthday dinner." Dedrick did not move a single inch. He looked down at her, his expression radiating a cold, professional disdain. "You are not a guest, ma'am," Dedrick rumbled, his deep voice carrying effortlessly down the hallway. "You are an active squatter who forcefully occupied a bedroom under entirely false medical pretenses. We have dozens of hours of encrypted audio recordings featuring your voice actively discussing the timeline for gutting the first floor of this property and laughing about forcing the rightful owner into a state-run assisted living facility. You are a named co-conspirator in a plot to commit elder abuse and financial exploitation. You are not going upstairs to pack your bags. You are going to go sit back down in that chair by the fireplace, and you are going to remain completely silent until the police officers are ready to formally take your statement." Patricia's jaw dropped open, her eyes darting frantically around the hallway as she realized she was completely trapped. The sheer terror of wealthy, entitled people facing real-world, inescapable legal consequences is a truly fascinating psychological phenomenon to witness. For decades, individuals like Patricia and Monica had navigated the world armed with aggressive complaints, threatening to speak to managers, hiding behind expensive lawyers, and using their perceived social superiority as an impenetrable shield against accountability. They believed the law was a flexible concept designed to accommodate the rich. But standing in my hallway, stripped of their power and their stolen assets, the devastating reality of the criminal justice system finally pierced their thick armor. There were no managers here. There was no one to bully. There was only the cold, unfeeling machinery of the law, and it was looking directly at them. Patricia slowly backed away from Dedrick, her shoulders slumping in total, unmitigated defeat. The haughty, demanding matriarch vanished, replaced by a terrified, shivering old woman who suddenly realized she might spend her remaining years fighting felony conspiracy charges. She turned around and shuffled back into the dining room, her stocking feet padding softly against the wood. She sank heavily into the chair by the cold stone fireplace, wrapping her arms around herself and staring blankly at the shattered remains of her wineglass on the floor. She did not say another word. The total psychological breakdown of the villains was complete. The grand, arrogant empire they had attempted to build upon the foundation of my life savings had been entirely reduced to rubble in a matter of minutes. I stood in the center of the room, observing the destruction around me with the detached eye of a master builder inspecting a safely demolished structure. The suffocating tension that had gripped my home for the past month was entirely gone, replaced by the chaotic, desperate sounds of ruined lives. Brian was still curled on the floor, his weeping devolved into dry, exhausted heaves. The remaining food on the mahogany dining table was growing completely cold, the expensive red wine sitting stagnant in the crystal glasses. The house was purging itself of the parasitic infection that took hold. I turned my back on my weeping son, feeling absolutely nothing at all. I walked with a steady, measured pace out of the dining room and stepped into the brightly lit foyer. The heavy oak front door was still propped wide open. I walked slowly toward the threshold, stopping just inside the doorway to look out onto the dark, quiet street. The flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers painted the surrounding trees in erratic, urgent bursts of color. I stood in the doorway and watched as the uniformed police officer firmly guided Monica down the concrete front steps. She was stumbling slightly, her hands securely locked in heavy steel handcuffs behind her back. As Monica was escorted to the cruiser, I reached into my jacket and pulled out one final document. I stood in the doorway, the crisp night air biting at my face, and watched Monica being pushed into the back of the police cruiser. Her emerald green gown snagged on the metal doorframe, a fleeting, pathetic struggle before the officer firmly shut the heavy door, sealing her inside the cage of her own making. I reached deep into the breast pocket of my tailored suit jacket, my fingers closing around a thick, folded piece of legal parchment. I pulled it out, feeling the heavy grain of the paper. It was the final nail I had meticulously forged for their coffin. I turned my back to the flashing red and blue lights of the street, stepping away from the threshold, and walked deliberately back down the hallway toward the dining room. The space was still saturated with the heavy, pathetic sounds of my son weeping on the hardwood floor. I approached him, my footsteps slow and completely unburdened. Brian was still curled in a miserable heap, his hands pressing against his face as he tried to hide from the devastating reality he had created. I stopped right in front of him, the polished toes of my dress shoes resting mere inches from his trembling hands. I looked down at him, my heart completely devoid of any remaining paternal instinct. I slowly unfolded the crisp white document, the sharp rustle of the heavy paper cutting through his erratic, desperate sobs. "Brian," I said, my voice dropping to a low, commanding register that forced him to stop crying and look up at me. His face was a swollen, tear-stained mess, his eyes red and wide with absolute terror. I held the document out, keeping my arm perfectly steady. "Take this," I instructed coldly. He hesitated, his trembling fingers slowly reaching up to grasp the edge of the paper. He pulled it close to his face, his bloodshot eyes scanning the bold black text printed at the very top of the page. It was an official, legally binding 30-day notice of eviction drafted and certified by Mitchell Reed just a few hours prior. "Because the house is now legally owned by the Foster Irrevocable Trust," I explained. Watching the color completely drain from his already pale face, the corporate trustee has formally evaluated the current occupancy status of the property. You and Monica have absolutely no legal standing to reside in this home. You are not listed on the deed, you hold no lease agreement, and your presence here has been deemed a severe liability to the estate. You have exactly 30 days to remove your personal belongings and vacate these premises permanently. If you fail to comply, the sheriff will arrive to physically remove you, and your remaining possessions will be forcefully discarded onto the front lawn." Brian stared at the eviction notice, his mouth opening and closing, without producing a single sound. The reality of losing his luxurious lifestyle, his fraudulent security, and his comfortable shelter was finally crashing down upon his shoulders. He looked up at me, a fresh wave of panicked tears spilling over his cheeks. "Dad, please," he begged, his voice cracking into a high, desperate whine. "You cannot just throw me out on the street. Monica is being taken to jail right now. I need to figure out how to post her bail. I need to hire a criminal defense attorney for her and for myself. We are facing federal wire fraud charges. I cannot do that if I am homeless. I need access to our accounts. I need money to fight this. I need you to help me just this one last time." I stared down at him, a cold, humorless smile touching the very corners of my mouth. I had anticipated this exact plea. I had known he would immediately revert to his deeply ingrained habit of begging me to solve his financial disasters. "You need access to your accounts," I repeated, allowing a heavy layer of dark irony to seep into my words. "That is going to be a very significant problem for you, Brian. You see, while you were busy driving to a luxury mountain resort this past weekend on my dime, I was busy performing some long overdue financial housekeeping. I contacted the bank on Saturday morning. I formally reported the secondary credit cards as compromised due to unauthorized fraudulent activity. Those cards, the ones you and Monica have been using to fund your extravagant dinners, your designer clothes, and your luxury vacations, are now permanently canceled. The accounts have been completely closed and flagged for internal fraud investigation. Brian gasped, his hands dropping the eviction notice onto the hardwood floor. He grabbed the front of his own shirt, his chest heaving as he struggled to pull oxygen into his lungs. "But my business accounts," he stammered wildly. "My company payroll, my operational funds. You cannot touch those. Those are mine." I shook my head slowly, feeling an immense, satisfying wave of closure wash over my tired bones. "Your business accounts were intrinsically linked to the primary joint account I foolishly set up for you 5 years ago to help you launch your software company," I reminded him quietly. "An account that still bore my name as the primary financial guarantor. I walked into the bank this morning and froze that joint account entirely. Every single penny currently sitting in that account is locked down pending a full forensic audit to determine exactly how much laundered money passed through it. The bank manager assured me that nobody, not even you, can withdraw a single cent until the federal investigation is completely finalized. You have absolutely no money, Brian. You have no credit cards. You have no secret stash. You are completely and utterly broke." The devastating truth hit him with the force of a physical blow. He realized in that singular, agonizing moment that he had absolutely no resources left to defend himself against the impending federal indictment. He could not hire a high-powered defense attorney to negotiate a plea deal. He could not post bail to free his manipulative wife from a cold holding cell. He would have to rely on a heavily overworked public defender to save him from spending decades in a federal penitentiary. He had tried to steal millions, and as a direct result of his boundless greed, he was now poorer than he had ever been in his entire privileged life. He let out a loud, wretched wail and buried his face in his hands, completely surrendering to the absolute ruin of his own making. I stepped over his sobbing form and turned my attention to the far corner of the dining room. Patricia was still sitting frozen in the armchair near the stone fireplace, her eyes wide with unadulterated terror as she watched the complete financial execution of her arrogant son-in-law. She clutched her expensive trench coat tightly against her chest, her breathing shallow and rapid. I walked slowly toward her, my footsteps echoing loudly against the polished wood. She shrank back into the upholstery, desperately trying to make herself as small and invisible as physically possible. I stopped a few feet away from her chair, towering over her trembling figure. "Patricia," I said, my voice a harsh, unforgiving whisper that cut through the sounds of Brian crying on the floor. "You came into my home under the cowardly guise of a debilitating medical condition. You conspired with your daughter to push me into a basement, to strip me of my dignity, and to eventually lock me inside a state-mandated nursing facility so you could comfortably enjoy the spoils of my lifelong labor. You sat at this very table and enthusiastically supported a plan to declare me legally incompetent. You are a vile, opportunistic parasite, and your time feeding off my family is officially over." She shook her head rapidly, hot tears ruining her heavy powder makeup. "Richard, please," she whimpered, her voice entirely stripped of its former aristocratic arrogance. "I had no idea what they were planning with the bank loans. I swear to you I did not know about the fraud. I was just following Monica's instructions. She told me to complain about my joints. She told me to take the upstairs room. I am just a sick old woman. I have nowhere else to go tonight." I did not feel a single drop of sympathy for her pathetic, cowardly tears. "You have exactly 1 hour," I stated, checking the silver watch on my left wrist. "You have 60 minutes to walk up those stairs, pack whatever designer garbage you dragged into my wife's sanctuary, and carry it back out the front door. You are not protected by any lease agreement, and you certainly are not protected by any eviction laws. You are an unwanted, hostile trespasser. If you are still inside this house when that hour expires, I will instruct the police officers waiting outside to arrest you for criminal trespassing, and for being an active accessory to grand larceny. Patricia gasped, scrambling out of the chair. She fled up the grand staircase in a frantic rush, completely betraying her fake arthritis. I walked back to the foyer. Brian had pushed himself off the floor, his body shaking violently. He shuffled out the front door without another word, stepping blindly into the freezing night air. I stood on the threshold watching my son stand alone on the concrete curb. His shoulders were slumped, his hands shoved deep into his empty pockets. He had no money, no wife, no future, and absolutely no father left to catch him. I watched the red and blue lights of the police cars fade into the distance, the sirens wailing softly as they carried Monica away toward her rightful punishment. I grabbed the heavy brass handle of the solid oak front door. I pulled it firmly shut, the heavy deadbolt clicking loudly into place. The house was finally quiet. The heavy deadbolt clicked loudly into place, and the house was finally quiet. The silence that settled over the property was not the oppressive stillness that had plagued me for the past month. It was a profound, cleansing peace. It was the sound of a foundation settling back into its rightful place after a destructive storm had passed. I slept deeply that night, a heavy slumber that washed away the exhaustion of the psychological war I had won. When I woke up the next morning, the sunlight streaming through the windows felt like an absolute victory. Fast forward 3 weeks. The legal machinery I had set in motion was grinding forward with ruthless efficiency. Monica was formally indicted on multiple federal charges, including grand larceny and wire fraud. Her precious social status was permanently obliterated, replaced by the grim reality of a federal holding cell. Brian was facing his own devastating legal battles, completely stripped of the financial safety net he had always taken for granted. They were drowning in the inescapable consequences of their own malicious greed, and I did not lift a single finger to save them. My focus was entirely directed toward cleansing my home of their toxic residue. I hired a professional remediation crew to deep clean every single square inch of the property. I stood in the driveway with a cup of black coffee, watching with immense satisfaction as the burly movers hauled Patricia's gaudy, oversized furniture out the front door. They tossed her ridiculous mirrors, her cheap artwork, and her pretentious velvet chaise lounges directly into the back of a rusted commercial dump truck. I paid the driver an extra $200 in cash to ensure those items went straight into a landfill where they rightfully belonged. The physical removal of their belongings felt like a spiritual exorcism, purging the house of the parasitic infection. Once the house was completely emptied of their presence, I turned my attention to the most important task of all. I retrieved the black plastic garbage bags from the hidden storage closet in the basement, carrying them carefully up the grand staircase. I spent an entire week painstakingly restoring Evelyn's reading room to its former glory. It was a slow, emotional, and deeply healing process. I custom-ordered new lace curtains, ensuring they matched the delicate floral patterns she had always loved so much. I rebuilt the damaged window seat cushions, sewing the fabric by hand, just as I had done 3 decades ago. I carefully unrolled her hand-knitted throw blankets, draping them over the back of a newly purchased vintage armchair that closely mirrored her favorite seat. I unpacked her massive collection of classic literature, placing each hardcover book back onto the solid cherry wood shelves in the exact alphabetical order she had always maintained. I polished the red oak floorboards until they gleamed like wet glass in the afternoon sun, erasing the scuff marks left behind by Patricia's heavy designer suitcases. Finally, I drove to the local police precinct and retrieved the vintage walnut jewelry box, which had been successfully recovered from Monica's closet, exactly as Dedrick had predicted. I brought it home and placed it gently in the dead center of the small oak side table. The room was no longer just a physical space inside a house. It was a pristine, undisturbed museum of our life together, a quiet testament to the 42 years of unconditional love we had shared. I stood in the doorway, smelling the faint, lingering scent of her lavender perfume that I had sprayed in the air, and I finally allowed myself to properly grieve her passing without the heavy burden of my treacherous family weighing me down. But as the weeks quietly turned into months, I realized something fundamental. I would spend my evenings wandering through the expansive, echoing hallways, listening to the silence bouncing off the walls. I had successfully defended my fortress, but the undeniable truth was that this house was simply too big for one man. It was a structure designed to hold a bustling, growing family, not a solitary, retired builder. The memories embedded in the architecture were beautiful, but they were firmly rooted in the past. My future lay somewhere else, entirely unburdened by the heavy ghosts of the life I used to live. I contacted a reputable real estate agent and officially listed the property on the open market. Because the house was legally owned by the Foster Irrevocable Trust, the sale process was smooth, highly secure, and entirely insulated from any potential legal interference from my estranged son. The market was incredibly competitive, and the property attracted multiple aggressive offers within the very first week. But I did not simply sell it to the highest corporate bidder or a wealthy entitled couple looking for a quick investment flip. I chose my buyers very carefully. I sold the house for its full appraised value of $2.1 million to a young, hardworking couple. The husband was a junior architect, and the wife was a public school teacher. They walked through the front door during the open house and immediately fell in love with the meticulous craftsmanship. I watched the young man run his hand reverently over the custom mahogany dining table, marveling at the solid joints. I watched the young woman step into Evelyn's reading room and gasp at the beauty of the polished red oak floorboards. They appreciated the hard work, the dedication, and the love that had built those walls. They deserved the foundation I had laid. They would fill those empty rooms with fresh laughter, new memories, and genuine gratitude. Handing them the keys felt like passing the torch to someone who would actually respect the flame. With the massive multi-million-dollar proceeds securely deposited into the protective accounts of the trust, I was completely free to pursue a dream Evelyn and I had nurtured for decades, but had constantly postponed to accommodate Brian's endless financial disasters. I walked into a premium dealership and purchased a luxury recreational vehicle. It was a magnificent rolling fortress, equipped with a full kitchen, a king-sized memory foam bed, and an advanced satellite communication system. It offered the absolute freedom of the open road, with all the comforts of a condominium. I packed my essential bags, taking only my most cherished photographs, comfortable clothes, and my sturdy toolbox. I did not need to carry a burden of material possessions anymore. The massive fortune I now possessed was simply a tool to ensure my total independence, a protective shield against a world that had tried so desperately to exploit my generosity. I started the powerful diesel engine, feeling the satisfying rumble vibrate through the plush leather captain's chair. I drove out of the city limits, watching the towering skyscrapers fade away in my rearview mirror. I left behind the cold winters, the painful betrayals, and the toxic expectations of a family that had fundamentally failed to understand the true meaning of loyalty. I was embarking on a grand solitary adventure across the country, chasing the warm weather and the breathtaking landscapes I had only ever seen in glossy magazines. 6 months later, I found myself standing at the rocky, uneven edge of the Grand Canyon, just as the early morning sun began to breach the distant, jagged horizon. The sky was painted in brilliant, vibrant strokes of deep purple, bright orange, and burning gold, creating a breathtaking canvas. The sheer, incomprehensible scale of the ancient geological formation stretching out before me was deeply humbling, putting the petty, insignificant squabbles of greedy people into a stark, clarifying perspective. The crisp, cool morning breeze swept across the vast open canyon, carrying the fresh, clean scent of desert sage and ancient stone directly into my lungs. I stood there in the quiet dawn, holding a crumpled, thinly lined piece of paper in my right hand. It was a handwritten letter forwarded to me by Mitchell Reed. It had been sent directly from a maximum security federal holding facility located in a completely different state. The return address clearly bore Brian's name and his newly assigned 9-digit inmate identification number. He had written 5 desperate, rambling pages begging for my forgiveness, pleading for another chance, and crying profusely about the miserable, terrifying reality of his long incarceration. I read the pathetic words, once my face remaining perfectly calm and completely unbothered by his dramatic pleas. I did not feel a single twinge of guilt, anger, or sadness for the man who had tried to destroy me. I felt absolutely nothing but profound peace. I folded the letter neatly in half between my fingers. I turned around, walking slowly away from the spectacular panoramic view, and calmly dropped the envelope into a nearby metal trash can. I never looked back. I walked back toward my gleaming luxury vehicle, completely ready to live the rest of my natural life entirely on my own terms. Respect isn't something that just happens naturally. It's something you have to establish boundaries to protect. What do you think about how Rick Foster turned the tables and punished the greedy individuals masquerading as family? Was he too harsh, or was it the exact price they deserved for their betrayal? Share your thoughts in the comments section below. Have you ever had to stand up and protect yourself and your assets from your own flesh and blood? I want to hear your story. If this story gave you a sense of satisfaction and taught you some valuable lessons, don't forget to hit like and subscribe right now. Join our community so you never miss out on these edgy, profound, real-life stories and the most spectacular, satisfying payoffs. Remember, you earned your money, this is your life, and absolutely no one, not even your own flesh and blood, has the right to steal your peace. I will see you all in the next story.